Women of Broadmoor. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Ivy. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Author's note on sources. This book draws upon a range of surviving 19th century records, including asylum material, legal proceedings, newspaper reporting, official correspondence, and later historical scholarship. Broadmoor's archive is rich, but it is not neutral. Like most institutional archives, it preserves women through systems of judgment. Doctors, clerks, magistrates, journalists, and administrators are the dominant voices. The women themselves are often heard only briefly. In a statement, a letter, a reported outburst, a plea, a denial, or a line copied into an official record. That imbalance has shaped every page of this book. The women discussed here reached the historical record because something in their lives became impossible for Victorian society to ignore. A child died. A household turned violent. A woman's conduct became frightening, scandalous, or legally troublesome. The surviving sources therefore do not offer an even account of female life. They catch women at points of crisis, then preserve them through categories such as insanity, danger, criminality, recovery, and relapse. This means that the archive is both indispensable and incomplete. Without it, many of these women would be almost entirely lost. Because of it, they are also never fully free of the language that confined them. Newspapers have been used with particular care. Victorian reporting can be vivid, detailed, and invaluable, especially for reconstructing trials, public reaction, and the language through which female crime was made intelligible. It can also be sensational, speculative, and inconsistent. Details may be exaggerated, moralist, or simply wrong. For that reason, newspaper material has been treated not as transparent fact, but as evidence of both event and interpretation. Medical and institutional records present a different challenge. They often appear authoritative, but they too are shaped by purpose. Broadmoor case notes, reports, and related documents were produced to classify, manage, and contain. They preserve conduct more readily than inward life, and diagnosis more readily than uncertainty. They tell us a great deal about how women were seen, and less about how those women understood themselves. Even so, fragments of selfhood persist within them, and it is often in these fragments that the women come closest to view. Secondary scholarship has been essential in placing these lives within the broader histories of Victorian psychiatry, gender, crime, motherhood, class, and institutional confinement. Where individual records are thin, context matters all the more. Social history does not replace biography, but it can help restore the world around a woman whose personal archive survives only in broken form. In writing this book, the aim has been neither to sensationalize nor to soften. Some of the women in these pages caused terrible harm. Some were themselves badly harmed. Many were both. The task has been to read them with seriousness, to resist reducing them either to monsters or to mere victims, and to recognize how power shaped what could be recorded about them in the first place. This is, inevitably, a partial reconstruction. There are silences that cannot be filled honestly. There are motives that cannot be known with certainty. There are women who survive more as outlines than portraits. Where the record is full, it has been followed closely. Where it is thin, caution has been preferred to invention. If this book succeeds, it does so not by claiming to recover these women completely, but by returning them to history with greater care than the systems that once named and confined them allowed. Preface. Broadmoor has long occupied a strange and persistent place in the historical imagination. Its name conjures walls, locked doors, notoriety, and fear. It belongs to a category of institution that seems at first glance to explain itself. A place for the criminally insane, for those judged too dangerous, too disturbed, or too incomprehensible to remain in ordinary society. Yet institutions like Broadmoor never hold only the meanings attached to them from the outside. Behind the label, behind the myths, and behind the official language of order, treatment, and security, were individual human lives. This book is concerned with the women. The history of Broadmoor has often been told through the most sensational outlines. Violence, scandal, and notoriety have proven easier to preserve than quieter realities. Men have usually occupied the larger historical frame, and when women have appeared, they have often been reduced to the most dramatic feature of their case. A poisoned sweet, a dead child, a gunshot in the home, a fit of mania, a courtroom scene, a newspaper epithet too memorable to die. Such fragments are powerful, but they are not enough. They tell us how these women were seen. They do not necessarily tell us who they were, what shaped their lives, or why Victorian society found them so troubling. The women who entered Broadmoor before the Edwardian age did not come there from nowhere. They came from homes, workplaces, families, and communities already shaped by inequality, hardship, expectation, and surveillance. Some were poor women worn down by labor, repeated pregnancy, hunger, grief, or fear. Some came from more respectable circumstances, but were no less trapped within rigid assumptions about feminine behavior, moral conduct, and emotional restraint. Some had killed. Some had attempted to kill. Some had frightened or bewildered those around them to such an extent that law and medicine stepped in to name them, judge them, and remove them. In every case, their entry into Broadmoor marked the point at which their lives had become intolerable to the world beyond its walls. This book does not ask the reader to forget the harm done by the women within its pages. Nor does it seek to turn suffering into spectacle. The sensational treatment these women received in their own time has already done that work too thoroughly. What is needed now is something more careful. The aim here is not to excuse and not to condemn in easy retrospect, but to understand. These women lived at the meeting point of crime, insanity, gender, and class in a period that drew hard boundaries around what a woman should be. When they crossed those boundaries, whether through violence, despair, delusion, or some combination of all three, they exposed the limits of the society that judged them. Broadmoor itself was part of that judgment. When it opened in 1863, it represented a specifically Victorian confidence that difficult human problems could be managed through classification, architecture, and professional oversight. It was intended as a modern solution to the problem of the criminal lunatic, a place where those judged insane after serious offenses, or deemed unfit to stand trial, could be confined under medical authority rather than dispersed through prisons and local institutions. In theory, it offered treatment and protection together. In practice, it functioned as both refuge and prison. For women especially, this dual role carried deep consequences. To be declared insane could save a woman from execution or an ordinary penal sentence. It could also place her inside an institution that would define her through diagnosis, supervision, and indefinite uncertainty. That tension runs through every chapter that follows. The women in this book were not all alike, and this is important. There was no single Broadmoor woman. Some cases became notorious. Others left only faint traces. Some women were remembered because they were first, or because their crimes were dramatic enough to endure in public memory. Others survived chiefly because the institution wrote them down. Together, however, they reveal a pattern. Again and again, female violence and female breakdown were interpreted through ideals of motherhood, domesticity, respectability, and bodily weakness. Again and again, women were made legible through roles such as mother, daughter, wife, servant, or patient, and judged most harshly when those roles failed to contain them. Broadmoor received them not as neutral subjects of medical care, but as women already burdened by social meaning. The surviving records reflect this burden. They are rich, but they are not impartial. Casebooks, legal reports, newspapers, official correspondence, and admission registers preserve a great deal, yet they do so through the eyes of clerks, doctors, magistrates, journalists, and administrators. Their voices dominate the archive. The women themselves often appear only in fragments. A plea, a denial, an outburst, a letter, an answer given in court, a remark preserved because someone in authority found it revealing. To write about them is therefore to work not only with evidence but with imbalance. What survives has already been filtered, judged, and arranged. That fact demands caution. It is tempting when confronted by fragmented lives, either to flatten them into symbols or to rescue them through invention. Neither approach is honest. These women cannot be restored to us completely. Too much is missing, and too much of what remains comes through hostile or self-interested structures. But incompleteness is not emptiness. Enough survives to place them back into history with greater seriousness than they were often granted in life. Enough survives to see the pressures of class, domestic expectation, bodily suffering, mental disturbance, and institutional power gathering around them. Enough survives to resist the old habit of treating them merely as monsters, curiosities, or instructive examples. This is why the book is structured as both lives and histories. The 7 named women at its center give the narrative its human anchor. Their stories carry the reader through Broadmoor's early female world in intimate form. Around them sit 3 wider chapters: on spectacle, on life inside the asylum after the verdict, and on memory and disappearance in the archive. That structure reflects the reality of the subject. Some women can still be approached as individuals with partial but graspable histories. Others can be understood only by stepping back and examining the wider systems that named, contained, and remembered them. To write only biography would be too narrow. To write only institutional history would be too cold. The truth lies in their meeting. The period matters as well. These are pre-Edwardian women, living in a Britain still heavily organized around rigid domestic ideals, intense class division, and an evolving but deeply moralist understanding of madness. Their world was one in which medicine and law increasingly claimed authority over disordered minds, yet did so through assumptions saturated with gender. To be a woman in distress was already to risk misreading. To be a woman in distress who committed violence was to become the object of urgent explanation. Broadmoor was one of the places where that explanation hardened into record. It remains a powerful symbol now, but symbols are often poor guides to reality. Broadmoor has become shorthand for extremity, and extremity can obscure as much as it reveals. The women confined there were not abstractions. They were not merely types of female deviance produced to reassure society about what counted as normal. They were historical subjects whose lives illuminate some of the darkest and most revealing tensions of their age, between motherhood and desperation, respectability and corruption, domestic order and hidden violence, care and coercion, sympathy and control. If this book has a guiding principle, it is that these women deserve to be looked at steadily. Not sensationalized. Not sentimentalized. Not tidied into moral convenience. They deserve, as far as the record allows, to be placed back within the worlds that formed them and the institution that claimed to explain them. Their stories begin before Broadmoor, continue inside it, and do not end neatly at its gates. Chapter 1. Mary and Parr, the first woman through the gates. When Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum opened in 1863, it did so with the confidence of a modern institution. It was meant to solve a problem that had troubled Victorian Britain for years. What should be done with men and women who had committed serious offences while judged insane, or who had been drawn into the criminal courts in circumstances where madness could not be ignored? Prisons were considered unsuitable. Ordinary asylums were not designed for them. Existing arrangements were inconsistent, improvised, and increasingly unsatisfactory to a state that preferred its categories neat and its populations properly sorted. Broadmoor was the answer. It was purpose-built, carefully planned, and presented as humane without surrendering the essential fact of confinement. Those sent there would not be treated simply as prisoners, but neither would they be free. They would live under medical authority inside a secure institution designed to contain the dangerous and the disturbed together. The language surrounding the asylum spoke of care, order, and treatment. Yet the need it served was driven as much by fear as by compassion. Broadmoor existed because there were lives Victorian society did not know how to hold anywhere else. Among the first of those lives was a woman named Mary Ann Parr. She is remembered in institutional history as the first patient admitted to Broadmoor. The distinction is blunt and lasting. It survives because firsts often do. Yet firstness tells only the thinnest part of the story. It does not explain who she was, what had shaped her life before she crossed the threshold, or why it was a woman such as Mary Ann Parr who stood at the beginning of Broadmoor's female history. To understand that, one must look not only at the new asylum but at the world that delivered her into it. Mary Ann Parr had killed her newborn child. The sentence is stark, and it would have been stark to a Victorian audience as well. Few offences struck deeper at 19th-century moral feeling than the death of an infant at its mother's hands. However common infant death was in broader social reality, and however often courts encountered cases involving concealment of birth, neglect, desperation, or direct violence, the idea of the mother remained heavily protected in public language. Motherhood was held to be natural, sacred, and instinctive. It was supposed to be the clearest expression of feminine virtue. A woman might be poor, abandoned, overworked, or disgraced, but maternal feeling was still imagined as something deeper than circumstance. When a mother killed, society saw not only crime but violation of nature itself. These facts were not hidden from the courts. They appeared repeatedly in inquests, depositions, and newspaper columns. On paper, the law could be severe. The death of an infant might be prosecuted as murder. In practice, juries, judges, and medical witnesses often hesitated. Was the woman fully responsible? Had she acted in a state of delirium or mental derangement? Had childbirth, fear, shame, or bodily collapse disturbed her reason beyond ordinary understanding? Was she wicked, desperate, disordered, or some unstable combination of all three? Such questions mattered because they determined not only the verdict but the woman's fate. Execution, imprisonment, or confinement as insane rested on the answer. Mary and Parr arrived at a moment when the state was constructing a new place for these difficult answers to be deposited. Broadmoor's opening was not merely administrative. It represented a broader Victorian ambition to bring troublesome human realities under systematic control. Disorder was to be classified. Deviance was to be separated into proper kinds. Crime and insanity, once uneasily managed through overlapping local systems, were now to be organized within a single institution built for the purpose. The asylum stood as a physical expression of faith in rational management. Stone, routine, records, and professional oversight would together achieve what improvisation had not. Yet from the outset, Broadmoor carried a contradiction at its center. It was presented as therapeutic, but it existed because society feared those sent there. It treated, but it also detained. It claimed to interpret disturbed minds, but it did so by placing bodies under surveillance and by denying liberty on terms largely controlled by others. For women especially, this contradiction was pronounced. A finding of insanity could spare them harsher punishment, even death, but it also shifted their lives into the custody of an institution that would define them from that point onward. Mary Ann Parr was one of the first women to undergo that shift. Whatever private misery had preceded her child's death, once she entered Broadmoor, it was translated into official sequence: offense, verdict, transfer, admission. The woman herself began to recede as the institution took hold. This is one of the most striking features of Broadmoor's early records. However emotionally dense the events preceding confinement may have been, the paperwork that follows is stark, orderly, and abstracting. It reduces fear, pain, and catastrophe into process. There is power in that reduction. Institutions often govern by turning life into record. Mary Ann Parr's significance, then, lies not only in what she did but in what her admission reveals about the female foundations of Broadmoor. The first woman through the gates was not a celebrated poisoner, a society scandal, or a Gothic figure already wrapped in legend. She was a mother whose newborn child died and who was judged insane enough to be removed from the ordinary criminal path. That fact matters because it shows where Broadmoor's female history truly began, not with theatrical crime, but with the collision of motherhood, poverty, shame, law, and mental disturbance. This was no anomaly. Early female admissions included several women connected with infanticide or related offenses. The pattern is telling. The 19th century was especially anxious about women who harmed children because such acts struck at the ideological center of domestic life. The mother was supposed to anchor moral order in the home. When she became its destroyer, explanation had to be found quickly. One route was to declare her monstrous. Another, increasingly important, was to declare her insane. The second route offered mercy, but it also protected the ideal of motherhood itself. If a mother killed only because her mind had become disordered, then the wider cultural faith in maternal instinct could remain intact. This was one of the quiet functions of psychiatric explanation. By locating the problem within the woman's mind, Victorian society could avoid confronting the full force of the conditions around her. The social world that had helped shape her desperation could remain largely unexamined. The woman became the site of crisis. Her body, nerves, emotions, and reason took the weight of explanation. This did not mean that mental disturbance was unreal. Women certainly did suffer severe psychiatric breakdown, especially around pregnancy and childbirth. But the interpretive habit itself was broader than clinical truth. It answered a cultural need. It made female violence intelligible without requiring too great a disturbance to the sentimental order. Mary Ann Parr's case belongs to this unsettled ground between pity and control. To modern eyes, it is difficult not to see the structural harshness of the world from which she came. A poor or vulnerable woman carrying a pregnancy under pressure, facing exposure and possibly abandonment, would have had few protections. The burden of childbirth fell almost entirely upon her. So did the burden of scandal. Men who participated in such stories often vanish from the archive or survive only as vague implication. The woman stands alone in the dock, alone in the report, alone in the moral imagination of the case. This asymmetry was not incidental. It was built into the gender order of the age. For that reason, the first female patient of Broadmoor can also be read as a figure of social abandonment. Not because the institution wholly abandoned her, but because it inherited a life already failed by other structures. Family may have failed. Work may have failed. Community protection may have failed. The law arrived late, after the worst had already happened, and medicine arrived by way of confinement. Broadmoor did not create the catastrophe. It organized its aftermath. There is a temptation in historical writing to turn the first woman admitted to such an institution into a symbol too quickly. Mary and Parr can seem to stand for everything at once. The criminalized mother, the poor woman under pressure, the first inmate of a feared asylum, the beginning of a long female history of confinement. She does indeed carry symbolic weight. But she was also an individual whose inner life the archive only partially preserves. That limit matters. It should prevent easy appropriation. The scarcity of personal detail is itself part of the story. Women like Parr often entered the record only at the moment of crisis. Before that, their existence passed with little official notice. They were not expected to leave detailed traces of selfhood. Their suffering became visible chiefly when it crossed into public danger. This is one reason the first chapter of Broadmoor's female history is so revealing. It begins with a woman whose life can be placed socially and institutionally, but never wholly recovered from within. We know enough to see the forces around her. We know too little to pretend full intimacy. That tension will recur throughout this book. The women of Broadmoor are both present and obscured, preserved and distorted by the records that survive them. Mary and Parr stands at the head of that pattern. Broadmoor itself would have appeared formidable, but also curiously modern. Its opening reflected confidence in architecture as moral management. Space was part of treatment. Classification was part of care. Routine was part of recovery. Patients were to be watched, fed, housed, put to work when possible, and held within a disciplined environment designed to stabilize behavior. For women coming from chaos or extreme deprivation, such regularity may have offered material relief. But regularity under compulsion is not freedom. Every benefit the institution offered came wrapped in authority. The woman admitted there did not simply receive help. She entered a system that would decide what counted as help and how long it should last. For Mary and Parr, that system began where the wider public story ended. Whatever public reaction accompanied her case, Broadmoor took her beyond spectacle and into routine. This is an important shift. The outside world often remembers women like her only at the moment of the child's death or the courtroom explanation that followed. Broadmoor reminds us that life did not stop there. The institution was built precisely for the duration after the verdict, for the long days and years that followed acute scandal. Once admitted, a woman became subject not to a single judgment but to continuing observation. Her speech, mood, labor, silence, and conduct all mattered. She did not merely have a past offense. She now had an institutional present. Her social position would have shaped how her story was told, how much sympathy she received, and how easily her life could be reduced to a grimly familiar pattern of fallen maternity. Mary and Parr came first. That is the fact most often repeated. But firstness is not only sequence. It is foundation. The woman at Broadmoor's threshold was not mythic. She was not a Gothic invention or a creature of lurid imagination. She was a mother, a defendant, a patient, a poor woman in a hard age, and the first female body placed inside a machine that would go on classifying troubled women for generations. The gates closed behind her and Broadmoor's history with women began. Chapter 2. Christiana Edmonds. Poison, Obsession, and the Performance of Respectability. If Mary and Parr stood at Broadmoor's threshold as a figure of poverty, maternal crisis, and social exposure, Christiana Edmonds entered the institution from a very different world of attention. Her name did not arrive quietly. It traveled through newspapers, courtrooms, and public conversation. She was not merely a woman who had committed a shocking act. She became a story and then a symbol. Victorian readers came to know her by a title memorable enough to outlast much of the life beneath it: the chocolate cream poisoner. The social world of 19th century Britain depended heavily on such readings. Dress, speech, manners, domestic conduct, and family background all functioned as signs of moral character. Respectability was more than reputation. It was a cultural system for deciding who could be trusted. A respectable woman, especially one from the middle classes, was supposed to embody moderation, self-command, and moral influence. She refined the home. She softened men. She upheld standards. Even when female weakness was discussed, it was often cast in terms of delicacy rather than danger. This was profoundly unsettling. Poison had a special place in the Victorian imagination for precisely this reason. Unlike a knife or blunt instrument, poison disrupted ordinary assumptions about violence. It could be administered invisibly. It required patience rather than physical force. It moved through intimate objects: food, drink, medicine, confectionery. It worked through trust. In cultural terms, that made it peculiarly suited to fantasies of feminine criminality. Poisoning seemed to convert the domestic sphere into a place of threat. It suggested that the gentle hand might conceal a murderous will. This is not to say that poison was a female crime in any simple statistical sense. Rather, it was often imagined as one. The method aligned too well with older fears about women's hidden power. Victorian culture frequently positioned women as morally transparent on the one hand and mysteriously unreadable on the other. They were expected to be pure but also suspected of influence. They were idealized as nurturing, but also imagined as capable of secret manipulation within the home. Poison drew on exactly that contradiction. It transformed everyday feminine proximity into menace. When it did, it was no longer merely emotional. It became morally suspicious and medically suggestive. This mattered because Victorian medicine and popular culture alike were eager to interpret female excess through mental instability. The woman who loved too strongly, who refused to withdraw, who acted rather than suffered, could be recast as a woman whose mind had slipped its proper ordering. Obsession in a man might still be discussed as passion, jealousy, or vice. In a woman, it was more likely to be woven into narratives of nervous derangement, disordered feeling, or emotional insanity. Christiana Edmonds therefore stood at the meeting point of two interpretive traditions: the hidden female poisoner and the woman undone by abnormal attachment. These traditions helped shape the public response to her case. There is a peculiar intensity in the way Victorian society reacted to women who violated the codes of respectability from within rather than from outside. A poor woman could be judged harshly, but she did not always threaten the cultural system that judged her. She could be placed beyond respectability and thereby made easier to dismiss. A respectable woman who became criminal was more disturbing because she exposed the possibility that outward moral order might be deceptive. She made visible the performance at the heart of respectability itself. This is one reason Christiana Edmonds retained such notoriety. Her case was not simply shocking, it was interpretively rich for the culture that consumed it. She could be read as the proof that female gentility was not to be trusted, or as a tragic figure driven mad by diseased passion, or as a warning against emotional excess, or as an example of how madness could disguise itself in polished forms. Each version told Victorian society something it wanted to hear. At the same time, the case posed a serious problem for the law. Poisoning, especially when deliberate and repeated, strongly suggested calculation. Calculation is difficult to reconcile with insanity if one relies on crude distinctions between madness and intention. Yet many 19th century cases forced courts to confront exactly that difficulty. A person could plan and still be mentally disordered. A woman could appear outwardly coherent and still be driven by obsession, delusion, or states of mind not easily classifiable as ordinary rational choice. This ambiguity is one of the defining features of Broadmoor's female history. Women were often confined not because their acts were obviously unthinking, but because the culture could not comfortably decide whether they were sane enough to deserve full criminal responsibility. In Christiana Edmonds's case, that uncertainty led not to the gallows but to Broadmoor. To a modern reader, this may appear merciful, and in one sense it was. A finding of insanity could save life. But it also did important cultural work. It reassured the public that this disturbing woman could still be understood as exceptional. If her conduct was madness, then respectable femininity need not be fundamentally revised. The system had identified an aberration. The woman had been medicalized, removed, and explained. That movement from scandal to diagnosis is central to Broadmoor's place in Victorian society. Broadmoor did not merely receive women after public drama. It absorbed them into a new form of narrative. The woman who had once existed in headlines, gossip, and courtroom fascination now became the subject of routine observation. Her moods, habits, speech, and bodily state were recorded within a framework that claimed deeper knowledge than the press or public possessed. The institution thus presented itself as the sober counterpart to sensationalism. Newspapers might exaggerate. Broadmoor would know. Christiana Edmonds, as a woman of more comfortable social standing, occupied this class terrain in a revealing way. Her case could be narrated as a fall, as the corruption of an otherwise refined life, as the sad breakdown of a woman who ought to have embodied moral restraint. Such narration did not spare her confinement, but it softened the terms in which that confinement might be explained. Her madness, if that is what it was, could be made intelligible through refinement gone awry rather than mere coarse criminality. This distinction matters because it shows that Broadmoor's women were never processed as blankly equal subjects. They entered with social meanings already attached to them, and those meanings shaped both their public identities and their institutional afterlives. Christiana Edmonds also reveals something else crucial: the relationship between female violence and publicity. Her case attracted attention not only because poison was frightening, but because it was narratively irresistible. It contained domestic intimacy, concealed threat, a woman's intense attachment, and the corruption of something ordinarily pleasurable and harmless. Poison sweets were more than evidence. They were symbols, and powerful ones. They allowed the public imagination to dwell on female danger in miniature form. Beautiful on the surface, deadly underneath. Such symbolism tends to flatten the woman herself. It replaces the complexity of a life with a memorable image. Broadmoor, however, had to confront the woman after the symbol had done its work. It had to hold her not at the dramatic moment of trial, but through days, months, and years. This is one of the most important correctives institutions offer to sensational history. However distorted their records may be, they remind us that women continued after the headline. Christiana Edmonds was not always a notorious poisoner in the active sense. Eventually, she was an inmate of Broadmoor, subject to the same routines of custody, observation, and time as other women less publicly remembered. That passage from notoriety to duration should not be underestimated. It marks the difference between the public's use of a woman and the institution's possession of her. Public culture wanted the thrill of the crime and the reassurance of explanation. Broadmoor took responsibility for the aftermath. This is what makes Christiana Edmonds such an important second chapter after Mary and Parr. Mary and represents Broadmoor's beginning in maternal catastrophe and poverty. Christiana introduces something broader and more unsettling: the woman whose class position and outward refinement made her crime seem to expose the fragility of social trust itself. Together, they demonstrate from the outset that Broadmoor's female population cannot be reduced to one type. The asylum held not only the socially vulnerable, but also women whose very respectability made their actions more troubling. Their lives were judged through gendered assumptions, their actions made meaningful within wider cultural anxieties, and their futures transferred into institutional hands. Broadmoor was the place where those different pathways met. Christiana Edmonds entered that place already freighted with symbolism. She had become, in effect, a public lesson about the dangers hidden beneath feminine polish. Yet symbols rarely survive close attention intact. What remains, on a more careful reading, is not a simple cautionary tale but a woman entangled in class, desire, mental disturbance, public appetite, and institutional power. That is a more difficult figure to hold in view, but also a more truthful one. The respectable woman who poisoned was never only respectable, never only a poisoner, and never only mad. She was all the things Victorian society needed her to be in order to explain itself to itself. Chapter 3. Blanche Bastable, the daughter who turned the gun. If Christiana Edmonds unsettled Victorian society by revealing the instability of outward respectability, Blanche Bastable disturbed it in another and perhaps more intimate way. Her case did not center on poisoned sweets, romantic fixation, or the hidden circulation of violence beneath polite forms. It was more immediate than that. More domestic. The force of that fact is difficult to overstate in 19th century terms. The Victorian family rested not only on legal and economic relationships, but on a deeply moralist emotional order. Within that order, the daughter was expected to be dutiful, modest, and subordinate. Her role was shaped by dependence. Even where affection was genuine, it existed alongside hierarchy. The daughter obeyed, assisted, deferred, and, in the best sentimental imagination of the age, loved without challenge. A daughter who raised a firearm against her mother seemed to shatter that structure all at once. This mattered because the mother-daughter relationship occupied a particularly charged place in Victorian domestic thought. Mothers were supposed to guide daughters into womanhood, teaching restraint, propriety, and the moral habits that underpinned family respectability. Daughters, in turn, were expected to embody filial gratitude and disciplined feeling. When strain existed, it was not meant to become visible. Household conflict was often tolerated so long as it remained private, softened by duty or hidden under silence. A daughter shooting her mother made the private impossible to contain. It turned domestic rupture into public scandal. Yet, as with so many Broadmoor women, the act itself tells only part of the story. Under such conditions, the home could become not sanctuary but pressure chamber. Blanche Bastable's case belongs to this darker domestic history. It reveals how violence in women's lives was not confined to childbirth crises or sensational crimes of public notoriety. Sometimes it emerged within the ordinary intimacy of family itself, where dependency and resentment had long been forced to coexist. The act of firing a gun at one's mother did not arise in a cultural vacuum. It happened within a world that expected daughters to suppress anger, absorb frustration, and remain emotionally legible within the role assigned to them. This is one reason cases like Bastable's were so difficult for the 19th century to interpret cleanly. The figure of the murderous mother had already generated a grim repertoire of explanation. Childbirth, infanticide, puerperal insanity, desperate poverty, the collapse of maternal feeling under strain. The daughter who attacked her mother fit no such ready-made framework. She was neither the woman broken by maternity nor the seductive poisoner hiding violence beneath gentility. She represented something else: the possibility that ordinary domestic relations themselves could produce intolerable strain. A daughter attacking her mother threatened that ideal at its root. It suggested not merely individual madness or wickedness, but a crack inside the domestic structure that society most wanted to trust. For that reason, such violence often invited intense explanatory pressure. It had to be made intelligible as something abnormal, exceptional, pathological, or tragic. Otherwise, the household itself might begin to look unstable. The use of a gun sharpened this unease further. Firearms carried strong symbolic associations in the 19th century. They belonged more readily in the cultural imagination to men, to public violence, force, authority, self-assertion, and physical control. Women certainly had access to guns in some homes, especially rural or practical households, but the act of taking one up remained symbolically charged. A woman with a firearm stepped outside ordinary expectations of femininity in a sudden and visible way. A daughter with a firearm, turning it upon her mother inside the home, violated both gender and domestic order at once. The gunshot therefore signified more than injury. It signified female rebellion made audible. Public fascination with such cases was inevitable. The Victorian press fed on domestic disaster because it transformed familiar settings into scenes of moral drama. Parlors, kitchens, bedrooms, and family tables became stages upon which hidden conflict finally erupted. The daughter with the gun was an especially powerful figure in this respect. She seemed to emerge from the heart of ordinary home life while carrying an act associated with masculine violence and open rupture. The result was a story at once intimate and theatrical, private and public. But beneath this spectacle lay the far less dramatic truth of family strain. Households were organized by power as much as affection. Age, inheritance, dependency, money, marriage prospects, illness, and reputation all shaped relationships within them. Mothers and daughters could be deeply attached, but they could also become entangled in ways that narrowed both their lives. A daughter who remained unmarried or economically dependent might live under maternal authority long past the point at which adult autonomy was possible elsewhere. Mothers, in turn, might experience daughters as companions, burdens, laborers, emotional extensions of themselves, or reminders of disappointed hopes. These pressures did not always produce affection. Sometimes they produced resentment thick enough to poison daily life. The archive, however, rarely records that slow accumulation well. It preserves crises more readily than atmospheres. It can tell us that a shot was fired, that a wound was inflicted, that fear spread through the household and authorities intervened. It is less generous in preserving the ordinary humiliations, arguments, irritations, and dependencies that may have preceded the moment. Was there a long history of quarrel? Had Blanche Bastable shown signs of mental instability before the shooting? Was her relationship with her mother characterized by care, domination, suffocation, mutual grievance, or some shifting mixture of all four? The records may hint, but they seldom settle such questions. What they offer instead is retrospective interpretation. Family members, neighbors, doctors, and magistrates looking backward from violence and identifying signs that now seem to have led inevitably toward it. That sense of inevitability is often misleading. Once a woman committed a shocking act and entered the orbit of insanity law, earlier moments could be reclassified as symptoms. Odd remarks, irritability, suspicion, emotional outbursts, or withdrawal were gathered into a narrative of decline. Yet such backward reading often oversimplifies. It can turn a complex domestic history into a straight line toward the asylum. In reality, lives rarely move with such clarity. They unfold through confusion, misreading, tolerance, denial, and delayed intervention. Families often absorb a great deal before they admit a member has become dangerous. This was especially true with women. A troubled man might be recognized as publicly threatening sooner. A troubled woman could remain within the family sphere longer, her difficulties interpreted through temper, nerves, female sensitivity, or household conflict rather than through serious mental disorder. By the time the law entered the picture, the crisis was often already acute. In that sense, Broadmoor women frequently appear to history only at the point when private life could no longer manage them. Blanche Bastable seems to have crossed precisely that threshold. Her case exposes one of the recurring truths of Broadmoor's female population. The female side of the asylum was, in part, an archive of household catastrophe. Again and again, women were admitted after violence or disturbance within intimate domestic relationships rather than through public criminal enterprise. Mothers harmed children. Wives threatened or attacked husbands. Daughters turned on parents. Women became feared within the home before they became intelligible to the state. Broadmoor stood ready at the point where private alarm became public problem. This helps explain why family testimony mattered so much in such cases. Relatives were often the first witnesses, interpreters, and complainants. They described behavior, recounted quarrels, explained fears, and supplied the emotional context through which doctors and courts attempted to understand what had happened. But family testimony was never neutral. It might be shaped by shame, self-protection, love, anger, or genuine bewilderment. A mother shot by her daughter was both victim and narrator of domestic breakdown. Other relatives might seek explanation in madness because madness offered the only tolerable alternative to deliberate hatred. That interpretive need could itself guide the outcome. A daughter shooting her mother was so morally shocking that insanity might seem more plausible than ordinary criminal intent. Why else would a woman commit such an act? Yet this question, although it appears compassionate, is also revealing in another way. It suggests how limited Victorian society's imagination was regarding female anger. Women could suffer, but active violent grievance remained difficult to comprehend except as madness. If a daughter's rage became visible, it threatened the ideal of female emotional self-government so strongly that pathology became a culturally satisfying explanation. This does not mean the diagnosis was necessarily false. Some women who attacked relatives were undeniably in states of severe disturbance, delusion, or psychosis. But diagnosis did more than describe. It translated household violence into a form that law and society could manage. It allowed the breach to be contained without fully confronting the domestic conditions from which it may have arisen. Broadmoor was the institution built to receive such translated lives. Once Blanche Bastable entered it, she ceased to exist primarily as daughter or domestic combatant and became patient inmate, a woman subject to routine, surveillance, and continuing interpretation. The shooting remained the act that defined her admission, but the institution's attention would shift toward behavior after the event. Did she show remorse? Did she persist in grievance against her mother? Was she calm, erratic, suspicious, coherent? Could she be trusted around others? Broadmoor did not simply inherit verdicts. It extended them through time, turning a moment of household violence into a prolonged medical and administrative question. For women, this continuing interpretation often revolved around emotional self-command. Victorian femininity permitted feeling, but only within constrained forms. Women could be tender, sorrowful, devout, patient, self-denying. They were not meant to be explosively angry. Female rage was especially difficult for the age to accommodate because it exposed the extent to which domestic peace depended on women's self-suppression. When a woman no longer suppressed, she appeared not merely angry but fundamentally disordered. A daughter with a gun epitomized that collapse of acceptable feeling. The symbolic weight of the act thus exceeded its immediate circumstances. It revealed the fragility of a system that assumed women would secure household morality rather than destroy it. It also exposed the narrowness of the emotional roles available to daughters. If obedience, usefulness, and dependence defined daughterhood, then what happened to the daughter who could no longer sustain those forms? Blanche Bastable's case suggests one answer. She could become unthinkable until violence forced society to think of her, and then she could be turned into a case of insanity. This is why her chapter matters within the book's larger structure. Mary and Parr established Broadmoor's beginning in maternal crisis and infanticide. Christiana Edmonds showed the threat of hidden corruption within respectable femininity. Blanche Bastable brings the focus inward to the family itself, where daughters lived under expectations so strong that violence against a mother seemed to rupture the natural order. She reminds us that Broadmoor's women were not merely public monsters or sensational criminals. Many were women whose lives had narrowed inside domestic arrangements until some act made the strain visible in irreparable form. The shooting of her mother carried Blanche Bastable out of the household and into the hands of the state. From that moment, other voices defined her. Journalists seeking a domestic shock, doctors seeking evidence of derangement, officials seeking order, and later readers seeking narrative meaning from fragments. The woman herself recedes behind these layers as Broadmoor women so often do. Yet the outline remains sharp enough. A daughter turned violence upward toward the figure meant to shape and contain her. The home failed to absorb the act. Broadmoor opened its doors. In that movement from household to institution, one can see the larger pattern already forming. Victorian society tolerated much female suffering so long as it remained private. But when suffering became violent, it demanded explanation and removal. Broadmoor was the place where those demands were gathered into daily practice. The daughter who turned the gun could no longer remain within the family. She had become a problem for law, medicine, and memory alike. Chapter 4. Rebecca Loveridge, Maternal Despair and the Death of a Child. Among the women who entered Broadmoor in the 19th century, few cases expose the unbearable burden placed upon mothers more plainly than that of Rebecca Loveridge. Her story did not possess the theatrical notoriety of poison sent quietly through sweets, nor the immediate domestic shock of a daughter turning a firearm upon her mother. Its force lay elsewhere. It belonged to one of the darkest and most recurrent patterns in the female history of Broadmoor, a mother who killed her child and then attempted to end her own life. Few acts provoked more horror in Victorian society. The mother was supposed to stand at the moral center of the home. She was imagined as instinctively nurturing, self-sacrificing, and governed by a love deeper than circumstance. This ideal appeared so natural in 19th century culture that it often escaped notice as an ideal at all. It was presented instead as truth. A woman might fail in many ways, but motherhood was supposed to redeem, stabilize, and complete her. The maternal relation was treated not simply as social duty, but as the clearest evidence of feminine nature. That was precisely why maternal violence caused such alarm. If a mother killed her child, the act seemed to strike it more than law. It struck at the emotional architecture of Victorian life. A woman who harmed the person most fully entrusted to her care appeared to violate not only morality but nature itself. Yet the very extremity of this horror produced a second response alongside condemnation. Explanation. Again and again, 19th-century courts, doctors and juries found themselves asking whether a woman who killed her child could have been in her right mind. However loudly society proclaimed maternal instinct, it also struggled to believe that a mother could deliberately destroy her child without some fatal disturbance of reason. This is the ground on which Rebecca Loveridge's case must be understood. She was a mother of several children, a working woman whose life had already been shaped by the demands of care, domestic labor, and likely material strain before the catastrophe that made her visible to the law. When she drowned her baby daughter and attempted to kill herself, the act would have appeared almost beyond comprehension. Yet, as in so many cases involving women and young children, that incomprehension quickly produced a familiar interpretive pattern. Was she a monster or was she mad? Had she acted from cruelty, or from a mind broken by despair? Was this murder, maternal derangement, poverty-driven collapse, or all of these at once? Victorian society never answered such questions cleanly. Instead, it oscillated between moral horror and a hesitant, deeply gendered sympathy. The notion of maternal insanity served an important function here. It made it possible to acknowledge the severity of the act while protecting the ideal of motherhood itself. If a mother killed only because she had ceased to be mentally sound, then maternal instinct remained untouched in principle. The problem could be located inside the woman's mind rather than in the social world that had brought her to the edge. This did not mean the diagnosis was insincere. Women did suffer severe breakdown associated with pregnancy, childbirth, exhaustion, and grief. But sincerity and usefulness are not opposites. The language of insanity could be both compassionate and culturally convenient at once. Rebecca Loveridge's case shows why. The Victorian myth of natural motherhood concealed the actual labor of mothering, especially for poor women. Motherhood was not merely tenderness. It was repeated pregnancy, dangerous childbirth, sleeplessness, feeding, washing, worrying, soothing, carrying, cleaning, and enduring. It was often performed under conditions of too little money, too little support, and too little bodily recovery between one child and the next. For women whose households depended on their labor in every sense, there was no clear boundary between maternal devotion and physical depletion. The social ideal praised self-sacrifice while offering little protection against its consequences. In such a world, maternal despair was never purely private. To speak of Rebecca Loveridge as a mother who killed her child without speaking of labor, poverty, and strain would be to repeat the very narrowing that made such cases so difficult to understand at the time. The archive may preserve the drowning as the decisive event, but the drowning did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from a life already shaped by unrelieved demands. The same society that sanctified motherhood also relied upon women to bear its heaviest domestic burdens with little complaint. When one of them collapsed under that weight, the collapse could be medicalized. What was less often examined was the system of expectation that had made collapse so likely and so unforgivable. The attempted suicide matters as much as the child's death. It reveals the act not simply as violence directed outward, but as destruction directed inward as well. In 19th-century interpretation, this often made maternal cases appear more intelligible as madness. A mother who killed her child and then tried to die herself could be read as overwhelmed by intolerable feeling, no longer capable of reasoned action in the ordinary legal sense. The impulse toward self-annihilation seemed to confirm that this was not merely cold criminality. There is always a temptation in cases involving dead children to choose too quickly between condemnation and pity. Yet Broadmoor's female history repeatedly resists such simplification. Women like Rebecca Loveridge cannot be held honestly in a single emotional register. They are pitiable and frightening at once. They expose suffering while also forcing us to face irreparable harm done to others. The child remains dead. The mother remains human. The law, medicine, and public culture all had to find some way of speaking across that divide. For Victorian society, motherhood made the divide especially hard to bear. This matters because Broadmoor's women did not arrive at the institution as abstract psychological cases. They arrived already marked by class. The poor mother who broke under strain would be read differently from the respectable mother who did the same. Even sympathy itself could be condescending, offered in terms that reinforced hierarchy. Rebecca Loveridge's suffering may have been acknowledged, but it would have been acknowledged through assumptions about poverty, labor, and feminine weakness that never quite escaped moral judgment. Once Rebecca Loveridge entered Broadmoor, the terms of her story changed. Publicly, she might have been known through the catastrophe, the drowning, the attempt on her own life, the image of a mother-turned-destroyer. Inside the asylum, that dramatic identity would gradually be absorbed into routine. Her conduct, not only her offense, would matter. Was she calm, depressed, agitated, remorseful, delusional, manageable? Could she work? Did she speak of the child? Did she speak of death? Institutions do not live at the pitch of public horror. They reduce horror into ongoing observation. In this way, Broadmoor transformed extraordinary acts into daily administrative questions. Broadmoor could record behavior. It could not fully record inner life. Yet the absence of such inwardness from the page should not mislead. A mother who had survived both the death of her child and her own failed attempt at death would have inhabited the asylum under emotional conditions no routine could flatten entirely. This is one of the deeper truths of Broadmoor's female history. The institution managed bodies and conduct, but it could not dissolve the emotional wreckage women brought with them. For mothers, that wreckage was especially charged. The role through which they had been most valued by society was now inseparable from the act for which they had been condemned, medicalized, and confined. Rebecca Loveridge remained a mother, but a mother in a ruined sense. Broadmoor did not erase that identity. It enclosed it. Such enclosure could be merciful compared to the alternatives available under harsher penal regimes, but it was also a form of long afterlife under judgment. The mother who had broken was now preserved as an inmate. Her case also reveals something broader about the relationship between female suffering and institutional power. Women were often expected to endure silently until endurance failed visibly. Only then did the law and medicine step forward. But by the time they did, the terms of interpretation had narrowed. The woman was now being read through violence, not through the long accumulation of strain that preceded it. Rebecca Loveridge's drowning of her child forced society to notice her, but it also ensured that everything before the act would be seen retrospectively through the act's shadow. That retrospective shadow shapes the archive even now. It tempts the historian to begin where the scandal begins. Yet to do so would be to remain trapped inside the old interpretive frame. The more difficult task is to recognize that maternal violence in the 19th century belonged as much to the history of women's labor and deprivation as it did to the history of criminal insanity. Rebecca Loveridge is not important only because she committed a terrible act. She matters because her case lays bare the impossible moral load Victorian culture placed upon mothers, especially poor mothers, and the institutional machinery that awaited them when they failed beneath it. If Mary Ann Parr stood at Broadmoor's beginning as the first woman admitted after the death of a newborn, Rebecca Loveridge extends that maternal history into a fuller and more devastating register. Parr's case introduced the connection between female confinement and infanticide. Loveridge's reveals the heavier emotional and social world behind such cases. Multiple children, prolonged burden, despair severe enough to turn not only against the infant but against the self. Together they show that Broadmoor's female foundations were not exceptional anomalies but deeply linked to the conditions under which women mothered in 19th century Britain. That foundation tells its own grim truth about the age. Victorian society revered motherhood in rhetoric and neglected mothers in practice. It treated maternal collapse as aberration while helping to create the circumstances in which collapse became thinkable. Broadmoor then received the women who embodied that contradiction too clearly. Rebecca Loveridge's story, however partial the record, remains one of the clearest illustrations of this cycle. A mother under strain commits the unthinkable. Society recoils. Medicine explains. The law hesitates. The institution opens its doors. What disappears most easily in that sequence is the life that existed before the act, the daily wearing down that left a woman with so little strength, hope, or room that death, for child, for self, or both, came to seem imaginable. Broadmoor could contain the aftermath. It could not undo the world that had made the aftermath possible. In the chapters that follow, the pattern shifts again. Maternal despair is not the only route by which women reached Broadmoor. Some entered through quieter but no less destructive forms of domestic instability, where the household itself became the site of fear long before the law intervened. Rebecca Loveridge's case marks one center of the book's emotional history. From here, the focus widens to the homes that did not immediately produce famous scandal, yet still generated the female breakdowns and violences Broadmoor was built to absorb. Chapter 5. Rebecca Turton, The Unstable Household. Not every woman who entered Broadmoor arrived trailing national notoriety. Some did not acquire a memorable epithet, inspire prolonged newspaper fascination, or leave behind the kind of dramatic case history that later generations easily recognize. Yet these quieter women are often just as important, because their stories reveal not the exceptional edges of the system but its ordinary workings. Rebecca Turton belongs to this less spectacular but deeply revealing category. Her case points toward one of the most persistent features of Broadmoor's female history: the unstable household. Again and again, the women sent to Broadmoor came from homes already under strain before any act forced public intervention. That strain might take many forms. Poverty might sharpen it. Illness might deepen it. Dependency, resentment, suspicion, grief, overwork, coercion, or emotional volatility might all contribute. Some households appeared respectable from outside and were nonetheless saturated with tension within. Others were visibly precarious long before the authorities stepped in. Broadmoor did not create these domestic instabilities. It received women after those instabilities had hardened into fear, threat, or violence. The Victorian home was meant to be the moral center of life. It was celebrated as a refuge from the harshness of the outside world, a place governed by affection, order, and womanly influence. Yet for many women, the home was also the place where pressure accumulated most heavily. It was where labor could never be set down, where relationships could not easily be escaped, where poverty was felt in every meal and every room, and where emotional strain could deepen in privacy until it became almost indistinguishable from illness. The ideal of domestic peace often depended on silence about what home life actually required. Rebecca Turton's case seems to have emerged from precisely that silence. Was she becoming difficult with her husband? Suspicious of neighbors? Frightening to children? Hostile to parents? Impossible to live with? The home became the primary site in which her condition was judged. That judgment was never neutral. Because Victorian femininity was so closely tied to calmness, usefulness, and emotional regulation, a woman who became the source of domestic fear seemed to violate her role at its core. She was supposed to soothe tension, not generate it. She was supposed to make home tolerable, not turn it into a place of dread. Once a woman no longer seemed able to perform this stabilizing function, her behavior could quickly be read not simply as distress but as dangerous female failure. Household breakdown became evidence not only of suffering but of her unsoundness. This is one reason the unstable household is such an important category in the history of Broadmoor's women. It reveals how often female committal arose not from public criminal enterprise, but from intimate life that had become unmanageable. The women of Broadmoor were frequently the women whom families could no longer contain. The archive in such cases usually preserves less than one might want. It records the point at which authorities entered the scene, but not always the long emotional prehistory that made intervention possible. A neighbor may have given evidence. A relative may have described alarming conduct. A doctor may have testified to disturbed ideas or dangerous tendencies. What is harder to recover is the atmosphere in the home before outside scrutiny fixed its meaning. Had there been years of strain? Periods of tenderness interrupted by volatility? Repeated warnings ignored? A family exhausted by the effort of coping? These textures rarely survive in full. What remains instead is a sequence in which the woman's behavior becomes increasingly interpretable as madness. That retrospective pattern can be misleading. Once a woman was declared insane, earlier incidents were often reread as symptoms. Suspicion became delusion. Anger became evidence of mental disturbance. Domestic conflict became the prelude to inevitable collapse. Yet households are complicated places. Women lived under conditions that could produce rage, despair, and fear without all such states being reducible to illness alone. This does not mean illness was absent. It means only that family life was never a simple diagnostic surface. This makes Rebecca Turton historically significant even if the surviving record is thin. She represents the many women whose path to Broadmoor lay through domestic disturbance rather than spectacular scandal. Her story reminds us that the female side of the asylum was not populated only by poisoners, child killers, or women at the center of notorious trials. It was also filled with women whose homes had become battlegrounds of fear, dependency, and exhaustion long before the state gave that breakdown a legal and medical name. The unstable household was one of the great engines of female confinement. That instability was often intensified by class. Poorer homes had fewer buffers. Overcrowding, lack of privacy, too much labor, and too little money could make every strain harsher. But respectable homes were not immune. There too, pressure could accumulate under the cover of appearances. A family concerned with reputation might conceal disturbance until concealment was no longer possible. In such settings, madness might be narrated more delicately as nerves or collapse, but the basic mechanism remained the same. A woman became intolerable within domestic life, and institutional intervention followed. Broadmoor stood at the far end of this process. By the time a woman like Rebecca Turton arrived there, the household had already failed as a site of management. Family members, neighbors, or local officials had decided that private means were no longer enough. The state then stepped in, turning domestic fear into public category. What had once been trouble at home became certifiable disorder. What had once been a difficult woman became a criminal lunatic or dangerous patient. There is a harshness in this translation, but also a certain logic in Victorian terms. If the home was taken to be a woman's natural sphere, then it was also the place where her breakdown mattered most. A woman who could not be safely housed within ordinary domestic life had, by that fact alone, become deeply threatening to the culture that depended on the home as its moral foundation. Her removal was not merely practical. It was symbolic. It restored the household, at least in theory, by taking the woman who had rendered it unstable and placing her elsewhere. This symbolic function of confinement should not be overlooked. Broadmoor did more than contain dangerous women. It absorbed the evidence that domestic life was not naturally self-regulating. For that reason, family testimony in such cases carried enormous weight. Relatives were often the first to narrate the woman's decline. They described fears, quarrels, outbursts, strange ideas, and threats. Their accounts may have been truthful, exaggerating, confused, or some blend of all three. Families under pressure are rarely neutral observers. They are frightened, ashamed, desperate, protective, and self-justifying by turns. A woman who had become alarming at home might be genuinely dangerous and still be spoken about through the emotional distortions of long strain. The archive preserves these accounts because institutions needed them. Historians inherit them with caution. Rebecca Turton's case belongs precisely in this zone of caution. She cannot be read simply as a victim of domestic interpretation, nor simply as a transparent case of madness. The truth is likely harder. A woman's mind may truly have been deteriorating. Her family may truly have feared her. At the same time, the language used to describe her would have been shaped by cultural assumptions about femininity, obedience, and domestic order. What broadens into historical importance is not certainty about every detail, but the pattern itself. A woman becomes the focus of fear inside the home. Others begin to narrate her as unstable. The law and medicine formalize that judgment. Broadmoor receives her. Yet that closure was rarely complete. Families carried guilt, stigma, relief, anger, or grief after committal. The woman taken into Broadmoor did not cease to be related to them simply because the institution renamed her. But the social meaning of the relationship changed. A mother whose daughter had become dangerous at home might now visit as the relative of an asylum inmate. A husband might become both complainant and correspondent. Kinship did not disappear. It became mediated by the institution. This long afterlife of domestic conflict inside confinement is one of the most revealing aspects of Broadmoor's female history. Women were often sent there because the home had failed to contain them, yet the home remained emotionally present in their case records and in the structure of their identities. A woman like Rebecca Turton may have ceased to be manageable in ordinary family life, but she did not cease to be a daughter, wife, or relation in the deeper sense. That debris is what makes her chapter essential. It reminds us that female criminal insanity was often rooted not in dramatic public transgression alone, but in prolonged domestic strain. The women of Broadmoor were frequently produced by the same home-centered society that later judged them for disturbing it. This is not an incidental irony. It is one of the institution's central truths. Once the household could no longer hold her, the state took over. Broadmoor's walls then did what they always did. They turned confusion into record, fear into case material, and a woman's troubled domestic life into an institutional file written mostly by others. Whether that file captured her reality is another matter. Like so many Broadmoor women, Rebecca Turton survives not as a full voice but as a disturbance translated into official terms. Yet even in that reduced form, her story reveals a great deal. It shows that the female history of Broadmoor cannot be understood without the home. The home was where women were expected to flourish, where their failure was most keenly felt, and where the early signs of madness were most often read. The next chapter moves from the unstable household to a more inward difficulty again. The woman whose very selfhood became hard for others to understand, and whose path to Broadmoor illuminates the deep Victorian anxiety surrounding female opacity, unpredictability, and the loss of socially acceptable identity. Chapter 6. Julia Spickernell. Female selfhood on trial. By the time a woman reached Broadmoor in the 19th century, the state had usually decided that her life could no longer be safely left to itself. That decision might follow a single violent act, a long period of alarming behaviour, or a crisis that forced the private world of the household into public view. Yet beneath these varied pathways lay a deeper and more unsettling question, one Victorian institutions never fully resolved. What was a woman permitted to be once she ceased to fit the roles that made her socially legible? This question presses with particular force in a case like Julia Spickernell's. Women such as Spickernell do not sit easily inside the most familiar narratives of female crime. They are not simply mothers undone by childbirth, nor respectable women turned sensational, nor daughters whose grievances burst into visible domestic violence. Their stories point instead toward something less theatrically obvious but just as revealing: the degree to which female identity itself could become a source of anxiety once it slipped beyond recognized forms. If a woman could no longer be securely read as daughter, wife, mother, servant, widow, dependent, or penitent, what remained? And how quickly might that remainder be named madness? Victorian society relied heavily on women being intelligible through role. A woman's place in the world was expected to be relational. She belonged to a household, a family, a social station, a moral script. Even where these arrangements produced unhappiness, confinement, or quiet desperation, they still provided the framework through which female life was judged. To be respectable was not only to behave well, but to occupy one's role in a manner that reassured others. The woman whose conduct no longer fitted that role became difficult to place. That difficulty itself could feel dangerous. Julia Spickernell appears to belong to this troubling territory. Her significance lies not merely in what she may have done, but in how her case reveals the instability of female selfhood under Victorian scrutiny. There are women in Broadmoor's history whose acts can be narrated through familiar cultural scripts: the poisoner, the child killer, the violent daughter. Then there are women whose lives seem to have baffled the people around them more diffusely. They may have become suspicious, unpredictable, emotionally inaccessible, agitated, delusional, threatening, or impossible to govern within ordinary domestic structures. Such women were often harder to narrate and therefore easier to pathologize. This is where Broadmoor's function becomes particularly clear. The asylum was not merely a place for confinement. It was a machine for turning confusion into coherence. It took lives that had become difficult to explain and gave them a framework: symptom, diagnosis, routine, observation, case history. A woman whose conduct had become alarming in the home or community could now be placed inside a system that claimed to know what kind of person she was. The institution did not tolerate ambiguity easily. It sought to stabilize it. Yet female selfhood was never something the institution merely discovered. It was something it helped produce. This was especially true for women whose identities had already begun to strain against acceptable forms. A man might be eccentric, proud, moody, or socially difficult without becoming wholly unintelligible. A woman's range was narrower. She was expected to remain emotionally recognizable, morally contained, and relationally useful. Too much insistence on grievance, autonomy, fear, hostility, or opacity could quickly become suspect. The line between strong feeling and disordered mind was thin, and for women it was often drawn by those around them rather than by the women themselves. Julia Spickernell's case directs attention to that line. Women who could no longer be read easily by relatives or neighbors often became frightening for reasons that exceeded any single act. They did not simply do something alarming. They became people whose motives, emotions, and intentions others no longer trusted themselves to interpret. A woman who withdrew into suspicion, lashed out unexpectedly, spoke incoherently, fixated on imagined wrongs, or resisted ordinary domestic expectations could unsettle those around her in ways that felt profound and diffuse at once. She threatened not merely safety but legibility. That threat mattered because Victorian domestic ideology depended on women being emotionally knowable. Women were often idealized as morally transparent. Their virtue was supposed to appear in conduct. Their feeling was supposed to deepen domestic life, not obscure it. But the culture also carried a counter-image of women as creatures of nerves, hidden passions, bodily instability, and secret influence. This contradiction meant that female inwardness was both sentimentalized and feared. A woman was expected to possess interiority, but not too much opacity. Once her inner life became inaccessible or alarming, the comforting image of feminine moral clarity began to break apart. This is one of the central historical tensions surrounding women like Julia Spickernell. Their cases reveal how little tolerance existed for female subjectivity that could not be comfortably read. The archive likely preserves Spickernell only after others had already begun speaking for and about her. By the time such a woman entered the orbit of law or institutional medicine, relatives, neighbors, doctors, and officials had framed her in particular ways. She might be called strange, excitable, violent, silent, suspicious, unlike herself, irrational, unmanageable. These terms did more than describe behavior. They registered the collapse of social confidence in knowing who she was. Once that confidence failed, institutional intervention often followed. Here Broadmoor assumed one of its most distinctive powers. It could convert contested selfhood into official case. Whatever a woman had once been to herself, the asylum now reclassified her as patient and mate. Her moods, habits, speech, labor, and resistance became evidence for continued interpretation. The institution claimed depth through repetition. It would observe her over time and therefore know her better than frightened relatives or sensational newspapers had done. Yet this claim was limited from the start. Broadmoor knew women through conduct in confinement, not through the full emotional and social realities that had shaped them. It recorded surfaces intensively, but surfaces are not selves. It would be easy to romanticize a woman like Julia Spickernell as merely misunderstood, a victim of patriarchal fear directed against female independence or complexity. It would be equally easy to accept the institutional reading and treat her as transparently insane because those around her found her so. Neither approach is adequate. Some women undoubtedly suffered serious psychiatric collapse. They frightened families for real reasons. They may have been delusional, violent, or incapable of ordinary judgment. But such states were always interpreted within a culture already primed to see female deviation through the lens of gendered disorder. The difficulty, then, is not choosing between illness and misreading as though only one could be true. It is recognizing that women's mental lives were made legible through social structures that often amplified fear and narrowed explanation. Julia Spickernell's importance lies precisely here. She exposes a realm of female history less dramatic than poisoning or infanticide but no less revealing, the realm in which women's selves became contested ground. A woman's speech, anger, suspicion, or emotional opacity could trigger a chain of interpretation that moved quickly from domestic concern to legal medical certainty. The people around her no longer knew how to hold her as daughter, wife, or neighbor. This movement says much about the limits of Victorian sympathy. Women could be pitted when they suffered in recognizable ways. Grief, weakness, overwork, childbirth, and abandonment all allowed some room for compassion. But women who became difficult to read often lost that room. This is why the institution's voice so easily dominates the archive. Once Broadmoor took custody, it also took narrative control. Julia Spickernell's life would have been broken into observations. Calm or excited, rational or deluded, industrious or idle, violent or subdued. These categories were practical, but they were also reductive. They imposed shape on a person whose difficulty may have consisted partly in resisting available shapes altogether. Women were expected to define themselves through others, through family, service, care, piety, domestic order. If those relationships frayed or if a woman ceased to perform them recognizably, she risked a terrifying social hollowing out. Who was a woman if she was not managing a household, serving a family, loving properly, feeling appropriately, enduring quietly? For some, the answer may have been inward confusion, rage, despair, or fragmentation. Victorian institutions were not interested in that question as a philosophical one. They answered it administratively. She was a case. She was a patient. She was to be watched. Julia Spickernell's story belongs to that administrative answer. It also reveals how class shaped the reading of inward disturbance. A respectable woman who seemed mentally fractured could be narrated as tragic, overstrained, or nervously ill. A poorer woman might be described in rougher terms as unstable, degraded, or threatening. The difference altered tone, sympathy, and perhaps the language of diagnosis, but not the fundamental mechanism. In both cases, a woman whose inner life no longer seemed governable through ordinary gender roles could be transferred into institutional custody. But certainty is not the same as truth. What remains striking about women like Julia Spickernell is that they continue to resist complete capture even in the records designed to define them. Something of the self escapes. Not because the institution failed entirely, but because no institution can wholly possess inward life. A woman may comply while inwardly grieving or raging. She may speak in fragments that clerks flatten into summary. She may seem incoherent while holding truths about her own suffering that others cannot hear. Or she may indeed be profoundly ill in ways the archive can only partially show. In every case, the record remains both revealing and incomplete. Broadmoor existed partly to manage that shock. If Mary and Parr introduced Broadmoor through maternal catastrophe, Christiana Edmonds through the corruption of respectability, Blanche Bastable through violence inside the parent-child relation, Rebecca Loveridge through maternal despair, and Rebecca Turton through the unstable household, then Julia Spickernell brings the focus to a deeper difficulty, the woman whose very personhood had become troubling to those around her. She shows that Broadmoor's female history was not only about acts. It was about intelligibility. Some women reached the asylum because their violence was dramatic. Others reached it because the people nearest them no longer knew who they were dealing with. That may be one of the most frightening thresholds in all institutional history. A woman can survive poverty, grief, and domestic pressure while still remaining socially recognizable. But once she becomes unreadable, once those around her cease to trust her emotions, intentions, or account of herself, the path toward confinement can narrow quickly. Law and medicine step in not only because of what she has done, but because the ordinary structures of relationship have failed to contain or explain her. Broadmoor receives her as the final answer to that failure. Julia Spickernell's chapter matters because it forces this process into view. She stands for the women whose danger was bound up not only with a single deed, but with the unsettling fact that others no longer knew how to place them except through madness. Her life, however partially recoverable, shows how quickly female opacity could become a matter for institutional power. Broadmoor did not create that opacity, but it turned it into record. Chapter 7. Elizabeth White. Female Ruin and Institutional Usefulness. Yet the final act was never the whole story. Women such as Elizabeth White are essential to the history of Broadmoor because they reveal how readily the 19th century turned female collapse into something useful. A ruined woman could serve many purposes. She could confirm moral lessons about weakness, vice, overstrain, or disobedience. She could support medical theories about nerves, heredity, menstruation, childbirth, exhaustion, or disordered feeling. She could reassure anxious families that frightening behavior had been recognized, named, and removed. Above all, she could be transformed from a person into an example. This transformation was one of Broadmoor's deepest inheritances from the world outside its walls. Victorian culture was fascinated by female suffering, but only on particular terms. It welcomed the suffering woman when her pain could be rendered legible as tragic, instructive, or morally clarifying. The bereaved mother, the disappointed daughter, the fallen woman, the overburdened wife, the nervous lady, all were familiar figures. They could be pitied because their pain remained interpretable within accepted frameworks. What the culture found more difficult to absorb was suffering that did not stay passive. Once distress became rage, accusation, bodily disturbance, erratic conduct, or violence, sympathy altered. The woman ceased to be merely a figure of pathos and became a problem to be managed. Elizabeth White seems to stand in precisely that unstable space. What makes women like her historically important is that they were often ruined in public twice. First, by the conditions that broke or altered them. Second, by the systems that then arranged those conditions into an explanatory narrative. Once a woman became subject to legal or medical scrutiny, her earlier life was searched backward for signs that could make the present crisis appear inevitable. Bodily pain, nervous weakness, family conflict, poverty, sexual reputation, strange speech, exhaustion, grief or loneliness could all be gathered and organized into a coherent story of decline. The act or episode that brought her to notice was then treated as the outcome toward which everything had always been moving. This retrospective logic was powerful because it gave an appearance of certainty. But certainty is rarely what human breakdown looks like from within. Women did not experience their lives as neat prefaces to institutional confinement. They lived through strain in fragments. One burden added to another, one illness layered over another, one humiliation following quietly after the last. Much of this remained socially invisible until it ceased to be containable. A woman could be failing for a long time before anyone in authority decided that failure had become dangerous. Elizabeth White's importance lies partly in drawing attention to that neglected middle space, the long interval before the institution, when distress was real but not yet formally classed as madness. This is where the female body becomes especially important. 19th century thinking about women's minds was saturated with bodily explanation. Doctors, magistrates, and journalists repeatedly turned to the body when women became unmanageable. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, sexual disappointment, nervous susceptibility, hereditary weakness, sleeplessness, bodily pain, and depletion all formed part of a ready-made vocabulary through which women's behavior could be understood. Sometimes these explanations reflected genuine states of suffering. Women's bodies did shape their mental lives in profound ways, especially under the conditions of 19th century medicine and domestic labor. But the wider interpretive habit was more than clinical. It relocated female danger into the body and thereby rendered it more manageable, more explainable, and less politically troubling. A woman like Elizabeth White could therefore be described as ruined in ways that were both bodily and moral at once. Her distress might be read through illness, her illness through emotion, her emotion through conduct, and her conduct through the law. Each step appeared reasonable in isolation. Together they created a totalizing account in which the woman herself became harder and harder to hear. The body that had suffered became evidence. The mind that had changed became diagnosis. The life that had been lived became case history. This is one reason the archive must be approached with care. Broadmoor's records and the legal records around them preserve detail, but they preserve it within a structure already committed to interpretation. A woman's complaints might be minimized as fantasy or amplified as pathology depending on who listened. Her physical weakness might elicit pity if she belonged to a respectable class, or contempt if she did not. Her speech might be quoted only where it sounded irrational enough to support a conclusion already forming. What survives, then, is not the woman unfiltered, but the woman as made useful to institutional understanding. Elizabeth White's chapter is about that usefulness. The women of Broadmoor were not only confined. They were arranged into patterns that could justify other people's authority. Their lives became material through which medicine proved its reach, law demonstrated its flexibility, and public morality reaffirmed itself. A damaged woman could be displayed as warning, specimen, or cautionary figure. Even sympathy, where it appeared, often operated in this way. The woman's pain mattered because it could be interpreted. Her collapse became meaningful because others made it serve wider narratives. This process was deeply classed. Poor and working women were especially vulnerable to being described as degraded or excessive long before anyone granted them the language of tragic breakdown. Their suffering could be treated as the ordinary consequence of hard living, bad character, or rough conditions. Middle-class women were more likely to be granted a different vocabulary: nervous collapse, delicate overstrain, hereditary instability, too much feeling. The pain may have been no less real in either case, but the social meanings attached to it differed sharply. Class determined not only how women lived, but how much complexity they were allowed to have once they began to unravel. Elizabeth White's case belongs inside this unequal terrain. Whether she was discussed in harsher or softer terms, it is clear that class would have shaped the tone of response. A respectable woman might be described as sadly altered from a former self. A poorer woman might be treated as though collapse merely confirmed a condition already latent in her social standing. Yet both pathways could end at Broadmoor, where institutional language did not erase class so much as fold it into medical governance. Even inside confinement, the ruined woman was not wholly separated from the social world that had first defined what kind of ruin hers was allowed to be. Once admitted, the woman as public problem became the woman as daily routine. This transition is central to Broadmoor's meaning. The act or state that had once inspired alarm now had to be managed over time. Elizabeth White, whatever fears or judgments attached to her outside, would have been observed through the ordinary mechanisms of the asylum. Her sleep, appetite, bodily state, conduct, mood, labor, and speech would matter more to daily life than the public story that had first brought her there. Institutions absorb drama by turning it into repetition. This can appear curiously flattening, but it also reveals how power works. Broadmoor did not need women to remain narratively vivid. It needed them to become administratively knowable. There is something almost brutal in that conversion. A woman who may have lived through prolonged bodily distress, social shame, or emotional erosion was now reduced to notes. Quiet, agitated, improved, no change, employed, excitable, melancholic, manageable, dangerous. The reduction made the institution efficient. It also concealed the magnitude of what had already happened to her. The suffering that preceded confinement and the suffering generated by confinement itself could both disappear into short descriptive terms. This is one of the reasons women like Elizabeth White are so easy to lose historically. Their deepest experiences are often compressed at precisely the point the archive becomes most abundant. Yet traces remain. They remain in the repeated emphasis on bodily condition, in the anxious descriptions of conduct, in the need others felt to explain why a woman had become intolerable. They remain in the very effort to make her useful. A woman has to be troubling before she can be turned into an example. Elizabeth White therefore reveals not only the functioning of the institution, but the wider Victorian appetite for female collapse as a site of meaning. Her life could be made to say things about womanhood, bodily weakness, moral danger, domestic strain, and the necessity of medical authority that made her historically legible. It also risked making her vanish beneath interpretation. This danger is especially strong where the archive records a woman chiefly at the point of her undoing. Many Broadmoor women appear to history not through their full lives, but through the moment at which law and medicine first took possession of them. Their work, ordinary relationships, unrecorded affections, daily acts of endurance, and earlier identities recede. What comes forward is the collapsed figure, the woman after the crisis, after the accusation, after the body has become a site of scrutiny and the mind a matter for others to decide. To write Elizabeth White's story honestly is therefore to resist the temptation to begin and end with the institutional label. This is the broader significance of institutional usefulness. Broadmoor did not invent the meanings attached to women like Elizabeth White. It inherited them, sharpened them, and gave them durable form. The institution stood at the end of a long process by which female distress had already been turned into something socially manageable. Its walls completed a translation already underway outside. The tragedy is that usefulness often replaced understanding. A woman's life could be legible enough to justify confinement without being understood in any fuller sense. Family members might fear her without grasping the depth of what she had endured. Doctors might describe her symptoms without recognizing the social and bodily pressures entangled in them. Journalists might narrate her as cautionary material. Officials might file and preserve her. At every stage, something real could be recorded and still something essential missed. It is also a history of women whose bodies and minds became sites upon which other people built explanations. Their suffering did not belong wholly to them once institutions began to speak. It became part of larger systems of knowledge, moral judgment, and control. If Mary and Parr embodied Broadmoor's beginning in maternal catastrophe, Christiana Edmonds the corruption of respectability, Blanche Bastable the violence of the daughter, Rebecca Loveridge the crushing burden of motherhood, Rebecca Turton the unstable household, and Julia Spickernell the anxiety of unreadable female selfhood, then Elizabeth White brings into focus the final converging pattern, female collapse as something socially and institutionally usable. She shows how women could be turned into lessons even while they were breaking. This is what gives her chapter its broader weight. Broadmoor was not merely a place where ruined women ended up. It was part of a culture that required their ruin to mean something. The institution could claim to treat, but it also classified. It could claim to protect, but it also preserved those women in forms that justified its own necessity. Elizabeth White's life, however partially it can now be recovered, belongs to that history of conversion from person to case, from suffering to example, from breakdown to administrative truth. And yet she is not wholly lost within it. No institution can fully possess the person it records. Something remains beyond the case note, the diagnosis, the legal phrase, the retrospective explanation. There was a life before the point of official usefulness, and there was likely a self that did not disappear simply because others wrote over it. The historian cannot restore that self intact. But one can refuse the old convenience of taking the institutional version as the only one that mattered. Elizabeth White therefore stands not only for female ruin, but for the struggle over who has the authority to define what ruin means. Victorian society answered that question with great confidence. Doctors, courts, clerks, relatives, newspapers, and institutions would decide. Broadmoor turned their decisions into enduring record. The chapter that follows widens the lens from the individual woman again. After 7 lives shaped by accusation, suffering, and confinement, the focus turns to the larger public culture that consumed such women, the making of the female criminal lunatic as spectacle, and the ways notoriety itself helped prepare women for enclosure behind Broadmoor's walls. Chapter 8. The Woman as Spectacle, Notoriety, Newsprint, and the Female Criminal Lunatic. By the time some women entered Broadmoor, 2 kinds of custody had already begun. The first was legal and medical. Broadmoor confined the body. Public culture confined the name. Crime reporting expanded in reach and appetite across the Victorian period. Newspapers fed readers not merely with facts, but with scenes, personalities, moral lessons, and emotional contrasts. Trials became narratives. Households became stages. Defendants became characters. Female defendants were particularly valuable to this machinery because their crimes could be made to signify so much more than individual wrongdoing. A violent woman was never merely violent. She was a disturbance in the social order, a breach in domestic expectation, a challenge to the sentimental image of femininity, and often, a source of fascinated horror. The public did not consume such women neutrally. It consumed them through form. A woman became memorable because her story could be arranged around a striking image or contradiction. Poisoned sweets, a dead infant, a gun in the home, a respectable appearance masking hidden danger, a mother turned destroyer, a daughter turned assailant, a woman whose manner seemed calm beside an appalling charge. The crime mattered, but its presentation mattered just as much. The newspapers did not simply report female transgression. They made it legible in ways that could be repeated, shared, and enjoyed. That enjoyment was always partially disguised as moral seriousness. Victorian journalism often clothed its sensationalism in the language of warning, public concern, and social instruction. The shocking woman was displayed as an example of what might happen when feminine nature failed, when domestic life concealed corruption, when emotional excess was allowed to deepen unchecked, when bodily weakness tipped into mental derangement. Readers were invited to recoil but also to linger. Sensation and discipline moved together. The woman's case became exciting because it was framed as socially meaningful. This was especially true where crime and insanity touched. A female criminal who was also mad or said to be mad had enormous narrative value. She could be represented as at once frightening and pitiable. Her violence could be dwelt upon without fully surrendering the comforting belief that normal womanhood remained safe. Madness made the exception narratively usable. It reassured readers that what they were witnessing did not require a general reconsideration of femininity itself. The woman who killed her child, poisoned a rival, or attacked a family member had become something other than properly feminine. She could therefore be stared at without threatening the ideal too deeply. This is one reason the phrase female criminal lunatic carried such force. It did not simply classify. It dramatized. The term joined 2 categories that already bore heavy moral charge. Crime suggested guilt, danger, and public injury. Combined in a woman, the phrase produced a figure almost irresistible to the 19th century imagination. Here was a person who had crossed the law and the emotional order of the home, but who could still be held apart from the ordinary by the language of madness. The public could indulge fascination while preserving its confidence in categories. These details did not merely color the story. They produced its meaning. A woman who looked ordinary while charged with extraordinary violence generated exactly the kind of dissonance the press could use. This dissonance was central to the spectacle of Broadmoor women. A woman was supposed to carry evidence of her moral condition in her appearance and behavior. The respectable woman ought to look respectable. The maternal woman ought to look maternal. The good daughter ought to look obedient. When a woman accused of a terrible act appeared composed, attractive, delicately dressed, or physically unremarkable, the contrast itself became news. It suggested that feminine appearance could not be trusted as moral proof. The spectacle of female crime therefore did more than excite curiosity. It destabilized one of the everyday systems by which society claimed to recognize safety and virtue. The public appetite for these failures was not confined to metropolitan cases. Local papers, regional reporting, and court coverage all participated in the production of female notoriety. Some women became nationally memorable because their crimes carried especially vivid symbolic elements. Others remained known only within counties or districts, but the underlying mechanisms were similar. The details that survived were those most suited to narrative retention. The poisoned confection, the drowned baby, the nightdress and blood stain, the revolver, the prayer, the letter, the husband or doctor or mother standing nearby in court. The woman herself was gradually compressed into these details. This compression is one of the darkest aspects of spectacle. It gives a woman visibility by taking away her dimensionality. Public culture remembers her because she can be reduced. Once reduced, she no longer needs the fullness of a life. She needs only a memorable relation to fear. The more striking the relation, the more durable her afterlife in print. In this way, spectacle and forgetting are not opposites. Spectacle is often one of forgetting's most effective forms. It permits the public to remember the outline while losing the person. Broadmoor entered this process at a particular point. The institution did not create spectacle, but it frequently inherited women already shaped by it. A woman who arrived after public scandal was not a blank patient. She came with a narrative attached to her. Staff and officials may have claimed clinical neutrality, but they were not untouched by notoriety. The woman known outside as poisoner, infanticide defendant, or mad domestic assailant carried symbolic weight inside as well. Her behavior would inevitably be read against what was already known or believed about her. Public narrative bled into institutional observation more often than official language admitted. And yet Broadmoor also altered spectacle by imposing duration. This is one of the most important differences between the world of newsprint and the world of confinement. Newspapers wanted the dramatic peak. The act, the arrest, the hearing, the verdict, the moment at which a woman could be held before the reader as warning, aberration, or curiosity. Broadmoor dealt with the years after that peak. It turned dramatic identity into routine. The sensational woman had to be housed, fed, watched, assessed, perhaps worked, perhaps calmed, perhaps restrained, perhaps waited on as the slow uncertainties of mind and conduct unfolded over time. In this sense, the asylum quietly exposed the poverty of public spectacle. No woman could remain endlessly interesting on the terms of her own headline. However vivid the public image, institutional life reduced it to ordinary repetition. The poisoner became a patient walking a corridor, sitting in a ward, sleeping badly, sewing, refusing food, asking for release, crying, growing older. The child killer became a woman under observation, perhaps withdrawn, perhaps remorseful, perhaps not, but no longer available to the public gaze in the same way. The spectacle did not disappear from memory, but it was no longer the whole of daily reality. This reduction of spectacle into routine did not restore personhood fully, but it did reveal something important. The woman continued after the story the public preferred. That continuation is easy to neglect because public culture trains memory toward beginnings and climaxes. It wants the moment when the ordinary broke open. It has little patience for aftermath unless aftermath itself produces new drama. Broadmoor, however, was built around aftermath. It existed to manage the time that came after horror, after scandal, after the public had consumed its fill and moved on. That long temporal dimension is one of the institution's most revealing features. It shows that women were not only displayed and judged. They were then left to live under the consequences of the display. The women in earlier chapters illustrate different routes into this spectacle. Mary and Parr represents the charged figure of the child-killing mother at the very opening of Broadmoor's history. Christiana Edmonds became famous precisely because her case could be condensed into a memorable contradiction: sweetness and poison, gentility and harm. Blanche Bastable offered the dreadful intimacy of domestic violence turned upward from daughter to mother. Rebecca Loveridge embodied maternal despair in a form both horrifying and pitiable. Even women with thinner surviving records such as Rebecca Turton, Julia Spickernell and Elizabeth White belonged to a wider culture eager to turn troubled women into morally instructive forms. Some cases produced national sensation. Others were local spectacles only. But spectacle operated across scale. What matters is not merely fame, but the cultural habit of converting women's crises into consumable meaning. This habit was deeply gendered. Men's crimes could certainly become notorious, but women's crimes were more likely to be discussed as revelations about sex nature itself. When a woman committed violence, the question immediately widened. What kind of woman was she? What had failed in her? What did this say about wives, mothers, daughters, servants, respectable ladies, female nerves, female passions, female bodies? A woman's offense was made to bear explanatory weight far beyond itself. This explanatory burden was one of the reasons female criminality and female madness were so often entwined in public discussion. Madness offered a way to contain the implications. The woman was not simply a criminal. She was mad, overwrought, deranged, morally insane, broken by nerves, undone by passion, affected by childbirth, driven beyond reason. Each phrasing helped move the case from social threat to manageable exception. The public could shudder but then breathe again. Broadmoor's walls stood at the end of this movement, making the containment literal. In that sense, spectacle helped justify the institution. The more frightening and narratively potent the female defendant appeared, the more reassuring it seemed that the state possessed a place secure enough to hold her. Broadmoor became not just a building but a public answer. It represented the promise that sensational female danger would not remain loose within ordinary society. The newspaper might amplify fear, but the asylum could absorb its object. Women were displayed, interpreted, and then removed. Spectacle and confinement supported one another. This relationship between publicity and enclosure also shaped memory. Some Broadmoor women survive today largely because the spectacle surrounding them was effective enough to endure. Others vanish because they were never made memorable on a wide scale. In both cases, public culture distorts historical understanding. The notorious woman becomes too visible in one narrow pose. The less spectacular woman disappears almost entirely. The archive that remains is therefore uneven from the start, with spectacle acting as one of its sorting mechanisms. To write about the woman as spectacle is not merely to criticize old newspapers for sensationalism. It is to identify a broader social need. Victorian society wanted female transgression displayed, but only under conditions that reaffirmed order. The dangerous woman could be looked at if she was also classified. She could be narrated if she was also enclosed. Readers could approach the unsettling possibility that women might not be naturally nurturing, naturally transparent, or naturally self-governing, but only so long as that possibility ended in explanation and removal. Spectacle made the danger visible. Broadmoor made it manageable. There is a cruelty in this rhythm. A woman's suffering or violence becomes public property. Her life is sharpened into a cautionary form. Her body is then transferred out of sight. Public fascination burns brightly and briefly. Institutional time takes over. The woman remains, but now under a different gaze. That shift from public gaze to institutional gaze is one of the most revealing transitions in the history of Broadmoor. Neither gaze was innocent. The press wanted drama. The institution wanted order. Both reduced women to forms useful to themselves. Yet between those reductions something still survives. The stubborn fact that behind every spectacle was a life larger than the phrase or image by which it was known. This chapter therefore marks a turning point in the book's structure. The earlier chapters centered on individual women and the specific pathways that carried them into Broadmoor. Here the focus widens to the culture that consumed such women before and alongside confinement. The aim is not to step away from personhood, but to show one of the forces that repeatedly stripped personhood down to an emblem. The female criminal lunatic was one such emblem. She was the woman whose conduct thrilled and frightened in equal measure, whose femininity became uncertain under scrutiny, whose body and voice were turned into signs, and whose final destination reassured readers that however unsettling she had been, she now belonged somewhere else. Broadmoor was where the spectacle ended publicly and began privately. The chapter that follows turns from that public making of women into something quieter and more powerful. Life after the verdict, when women ceased to be immediate sensations and became inhabitants of the institution itself. Chapter 9. After the verdict. Women living inside Broadmoor. Once the trial ended, once the doctors had spoken, once the committal papers were signed and the gates closed, a woman's public story was supposed to be over. In one sense it was. Whatever notoriety, pity or alarm had gathered around her outside now gave way to the quieter authority of the institution. Broadmoor did not exist for dramatic endings. It existed for what came after them. The woman who had been judged, explained and removed still had to live. That fact is easy to overlook. This chapter turns to that holding. For the women confined within Broadmoor, life after the verdict was not simply a blank continuation of punishment. It was a structured world governed by routine, surveillance, hierarchy, and repetition. The institution promised treatment, order, and safety. It also demanded submission. A woman's movements, speech, work, health, correspondence, and associations could all fall within the range of official attention. Whatever act had first brought her there, she was now expected to live inside a system that treated daily conduct as evidence. The spectacular crime receded. Behavior took its place. This shift mattered because it transformed female identity in a new way. Outside Broadmoor, a woman might have been known as a mother, daughter, wife, servant, lady, widow, or scandalous defendant. Inside, those older identities did not disappear, but they were subordinated to a more powerful one, patient and mate. The institution did not simply care for women. It reclassified them. Their previous lives became background to the ongoing question of whether they were calm, dangerous, industrious, melancholic, deluded, excitable, trustworthy, improving, or still unsafe to release. Time in Broadmoor was therefore diagnostic as much as custodial. This is one reason institutional life deserves closer attention than it often receives. It was not merely the setting in which women waited. It was the medium through which they were continually reinterpreted. A woman who had seemed deranged in crisis might appear quiet and orderly within routine. Another might seem improved only to relapse under emotional strain. A woman whose violence had looked inexplicable outside might settle into habits of work and obedience that made her past offense feel both more distant and more haunting. The institution recorded these changes not as mysteries of personhood, but as observations to be evaluated. And yet, however clinical its language, life inside Broadmoor was never merely clinical. It was deeply human in the most ordinary and painful ways. Women slept, woke, ate, walked, worked, stitched, scrubbed, prayed, complained, waited, fell ill, made requests, grieved and aged. Some resisted rules. Some adapted themselves to them. Some sought discharge with desperate hope. Others may have come to fear the world beyond the asylum more than confinement itself. Institutions often generate this cruel paradox. The place that limits freedom can also become the only stable environment a person has known for years. For women whose earlier lives had been marked by severe poverty, violence, or mental disturbance, Broadmoor may have felt at once oppressive and materially more secure than anything outside its walls. That contradiction should not be softened. It is central to the institution's meaning. The woman after the verdict was therefore still very much a woman under judgment. This continuing judgment was especially heavy for women because their behavior inside the asylum was read through familiar gendered expectations. Was she neat, orderly, cooperative, modest, industrious, maternal toward weaker inmates, irritable, quarrelsome, defiant, inappropriately sexual in speech or manner? The same assumptions that had shaped the interpretation of her earlier life did not vanish when she entered Broadmoor. They followed her into the wards. Femininity remained under scrutiny, only now in institutional form. A calm, hard-working woman might appear redeemable because she resembled the domestic ideal once more. A difficult or angry woman could seem to confirm her unsoundness. Tears might be treated as natural feminine feeling or as emotional instability depending on class and context. Silence might be read as self-control, sullenness, or depression. Nothing in the institution was free of interpretation, and interpretation was never gender-neutral. This reconstruction had clear limits. A woman could sew neatly and still remain confined. She could behave well for long periods and still be judged unsafe. Institutional usefulness did not necessarily restore personhood. Often it simply made custody easier to manage. Others may have experienced the grinding sameness of institutional life as a second wound layered over the first. The archive, usually more interested in disruption than continuity, rarely tells these quieter stories in full. But it hints at them. And the hints are enough to show that asylum life was not an empty interval between admission and death or discharge. It was life, however constrained. One of the cruelest features of such life was uncertainty. Many women would not have known how long they were to remain. The logic of confinement under insanity differed sharply from ordinary punishment. A prison sentence, however harsh, at least carried an endpoint. Broadmoor operated according to a more unstable horizon. Release depended on improvement, but improvement itself was not always easy to prove. A woman could appear well and still be kept because the original offense had been too grave, because officials feared relapse, or because no one outside wished to receive her. The very indeterminacy meant to serve care could become a source of despair. For women, this uncertainty could be sharpened by family ties. Some remained connected to relatives outside. Others were forgotten, abandoned, or only intermittently remembered. Letters, visits, and inquiries carried immense emotional weight in institutional settings. They could sustain hope or deepen pain. A woman confined after harming a family member or after the death of a child may have experienced these connections as especially fraught. Who would write? Who would forgive? Who would want her back? Broadmoor held women apart from the very relationships through which they had once been defined, while still leaving them emotionally bound to those relationships' wreckage. This may be the deepest tragedy of the woman after the verdict. She did not cease to be daughter, mother, or wife simply because the institution renamed her. Those earlier identities persisted, but now in damaged form. The mother remained a mother without her child. The wife remained linked to a marriage altered by violence, scandal, or fear. The daughter remained attached to a family memory that could never be repaired. Broadmoor managed bodies and conduct. For all its confidence in observation, the institution knew women only through surfaces, routines, and episodes of speech or disturbance. It could chart behavior, but it could not finally possess thought. A woman might outwardly comply while inwardly grieving, raging, planning, hoping, or emptying herself into silence. She might accept the rhythms of the ward while never agreeing to the account of herself that had placed her there. The casebook could never fully capture this inward remainder. Something of the self stayed beyond institutional language, even if only as absence. That matters because historians can be tempted to see institutional records as total. They are not. They are authoritative, but authority is not completeness. The woman after the verdict often survives in those records as a sequence of notations. Health fair, conduct quiet, employed in sewing, slept well, excited, refused food, improving, no change. Such entries can feel chillingly thin beside the magnitude of the lives they summarize. Yet their thinness is revealing. It shows how institutions reduce complexity in order to function. They must turn lived time into manageable information. Broadmoor was exceptionally good at this reduction. That was part of its design. But reduction did not erase reality. Behind every note lay a woman enduring another day within walls she had not chosen. Some days may have passed without incident. Others may have opened old griefs or new terrors. The institution treated continuity as stability. Human beings experience continuity far less neatly. This perspective also changes how one understands recovery. Recovery in Broadmoor could mean many things. It might mean the easing of acute symptoms. It might mean adaptation to routine. It might mean learning how to appear manageable to authority. It might mean genuine restoration of mental equilibrium, or simply exhaustion after years of resistance. The official language of improvement often conceals as much as it reveals. A woman described as recovered may still have been profoundly damaged by what had happened before and during confinement. A woman deemed unrecovered may nonetheless have possessed lucidity that institutions failed to recognize because it did not fit expected forms. The woman after the verdict therefore occupies a morally difficult space. She is neither simply condemned nor simply healed. She is contained, observed, and interpreted through time. That temporal dimension is what makes Broadmoor such an important subject. It shows how 19th century society handled not only female transgression and female madness, but female endurance. The institution did not merely isolate problematic women. It organized the ongoing existence of those women once the public drama had passed. This helps explain why the quieter histories of Broadmoor matter as much as the famous cases. The daily life of the institution reveals the real consequences of legal and medical decisions. To call a woman insane was not just to classify her. It was to subject her to years of regulated living under a structure that could define her future. Every verdict had a domestic sequel within the asylum walls. A bed, a ward, a set of tasks, a file, a body under care, a mind under watch. For the women in this book, that sequel was not incidental. It was the greater part of what Broadmoor meant. Mary Ann Parr, Christiana Edmonds, Blanche Bastable, Rebecca Loveridge, Rebecca Turton, Julia Spickernell, and Elizabeth White all arrived through different pathways, but once inside they entered this shared world of duration. However distinct their offenses or social backgrounds, the institution worked on them through the same instruments: routine, labor, observation, patience, classification, and delay. Broadmoor's women were made comparable there even when their lives had been incomparable outside. That leveling effect was one of the institution's most powerful claims. It suggested that beneath all differences of class, scandal, and circumstance, the asylum could identify the essential question: was this woman still insane, or was she safe? Yet such a question, though practical, was never simple. Safe to whom? Sane by what measure? Return to what kind of world? For many women, the outside to which they might theoretically return was the very world in which their breakdown had occurred. Broadmoor's decisions were made against that background, whether acknowledged or not. The institution then was not only a place of confinement. It was a place where time itself became a form of power. This is one of the strongest reasons to pause over life after the verdict rather than hurrying on to the next dramatic case. The spectacle of female crime tempts history toward sharp outlines and rapid judgment. Broadmoor, by contrast, insists on duration, uncertainty, and the slow wearing effects of institutional existence. It shows women not only as the figures they became in newspapers and courts, but as people forced to continue under a regime that absorbed the consequences of those public moments into everyday discipline. In this way, the asylum quietly undid the simplicity of the stories that fed it. The poisoner could not remain forever only a poisoner. The child killer could not remain forever only the image fixed at trial. The troubled daughter, the unstable wife, the unreadable woman, the ruined woman, all had to become, day after day, inmates within a structured environment that asked more of them than mere symbolic value. They had to live. And living, even in confinement, produced a history more complex than public judgment had prepared society to see. The chapter that follows brings this pre-Edwardian sequence toward its close by examining what Broadmoor ultimately did to memory. Some women left. Some died within confinement. Some faded into sparse and impersonal record. The question is not only what happened to them, but how a place like Broadmoor shaped the terms on which they could be remembered at all. Chapter 10. After Broadmoor: Memory, Disappearance, and the Female Archive. By the time a woman had passed through Broadmoor's gates, the world had already begun deciding how or whether she would be remembered. Some entered the record through a single appalling act and remained attached to it forever. Some lingered as medical curiosities, their lives preserved in fragments because doctors, officials, or journalists found them useful. Others disappeared almost entirely, leaving behind only a name in an index, a line in a register, a brief mention in a newspaper column, or a scattered reference in official papers. Broadmoor did not merely confine women in life. It shaped the terms of their afterlife in history. This final chapter turns to that problem of memory. Institutions are powerful not only because they hold bodies, but because they organize what survives of them. Broadmoor was a machine of record. It produced admission books, case notes, correspondence, certificates, observations, transfer records, recommendations, and administrative summaries. These documents were never neutral. They preserved women as the institution needed them preserved. As cases, risks, patients, inmates, examples of improvement, examples of relapse, lives made legible through categories that served custody. For the historian, this preservation is invaluable. Without it, many of these women would vanish altogether. Yet it is also distorting. What survives is what authority found worth writing down. That means the women of Broadmoor reach the present through an archive that is both generous and impoverished. It is generous because it often preserves more about disturbed and criminalized women than ordinary life otherwise would. Many poor or socially marginal women left little documentary trace unless something catastrophic occurred. Broadmoor and the legal system surrounding it recorded women who might otherwise have been lost to history altogether. In that sense, institutions created an accidental archive of female suffering and female transgression. But the archive is impoverished because it catches women at the point of crisis and keeps them there. Their personhood survives under pressure, filtered through judgment, diagnosis, and control. This is especially true for pre-Edwardian women, whose lives were already vulnerable to erasure for reasons of class and gender. 19th-century documentation tended to privilege men's public actions and women's domestic roles, but only so long as those roles remained untroubling. Women whose lives followed ordinary patterns might vanish into parish, census, and family records with little sense of their inner selves. Women who entered Broadmoor were recorded in far more detail, but at the cost of being fixed within institutional narratives of disorder. They are visible to us because something went terribly wrong. That is the bargain the archive offers. Memory, then, is uneven from the start. A woman like Christiana Edmonds survives because sensational culture attached itself to her name so effectively that later generations kept repeating it. Mary Ann Parr remains visible because of firstness. The first patient, the first woman through the gates, the beginning of Broadmoor's female story in a form neat enough for institutional remembrance. Others survive because their cases fit themes later historians find compelling: infanticide, poisoning, motherhood, domestic violence, female madness, the law. But many more women slip toward obscurity precisely because they were neither dramatic enough to become legend nor ordinary enough to be tenderly preserved within family memory. They occupy a historical middle space in which the institution's version of them may be all that remains. This is one reason the female Broadmoor archive can feel so haunting. One repeatedly encounters women whose lives were once judged urgent enough for confinement, but are now so thinly preserved that they seem to flicker at the edge of recoverability. A surname, an offense, a diagnosis, a date, a note on conduct, a transfer, a death, perhaps a sentence copied into a ledger. That may be all. It is enough to prove existence but not enough to restore presence. The temptation is to fill such gaps with invention, sentiment, or false certainty. But the gaps are themselves part of the truth. They reveal what kinds of women history has struggled to keep. Women disappear from the archive in gendered ways. Men who committed crimes often left records tied to work, property, military service, public office, or broader legal histories. Women's traces were more likely to remain relational: wife of, daughter of, mother of, servant to. When a woman entered Broadmoor, those relational identities could fracture, and the archive that remained became more heavily institutional than familial. If she was not reclaimed, not forgiven, or not reintegrated into ordinary domestic memory, the institution's account of her might become the dominant one. In effect, Broadmoor could replace kinship as the place from which a woman was historically known. That replacement was profound. It meant that women who had once lived inside dense emotional networks could be remembered finally through administrative prose. The mother became a case of infanticide and melancholia. The daughter became a violent patient. The respectable woman became a poisoner under observation. The unstable relation became a subject of continued detention. Every category narrowed the woman's relation to the future. And yet, paradoxically, Broadmoor also preserved what private life often did not. Families silenced scandal. Communities moved on. Newspapers misreported, exaggerated, or forgot. The institution kept writing. It recorded conduct after the sensation faded. It followed women through years rather than moments. In doing so, it exposed a truth that public culture often ignored. Women did not stop existing once their names ceased to be useful. They continued in confinement, aged within it, changed within it, or disappeared from it through discharge, transfer, or death. Institutional memory, however cold, still testified to that continuity. This continuity matters because it resists the simplifications of both scandal and pity. The women of Broadmoor were not frozen forever at the point of their offense. Some improved. Some deteriorated. Some remain difficult to classify. Some may have settled into lives so quiet that only the old violence attached to their names kept them from seeming unremarkable. The archive cannot restore them fully, but it does show duration, and duration is a kind of dignity against spectacle. It reminds us that a human life is not exhausted by its worst hour, however terrible that hour may have been. Still, the institution decided which forms of duration counted. A woman who worked steadily, obeyed rules, and ceased alarming staff would be remembered in one register. A woman who remained distressed, resistant, or delusional would be remembered in another. These distinctions shaped not only daily treatment, but historical survivability. A good inmate could disappear into bland institutional language. A disruptive one might generate more detailed notes precisely because she remained troublesome. Thus, the archive often enlarges disorder and compresses stability. Historians inherit a skewed emotional landscape in which crises glow brighter than long seasons of endurance. This skew affects how female confinement is remembered culturally. Broadmoor's women are easier to summon as dramatic figures than as people who lived through dull, humiliating, repetitive institutional time. Yet that institutional time was often the greater part of their story. The woman remembered as notorious may have spent far longer sewing, walking the grounds, refusing food, writing petitions, being examined by doctors, or sitting in silence than she ever spent committing the act that made her famous. If memory remains tied only to the sensational beginning, then Broadmoor itself becomes strangely invisible, reduced to backdrop rather than understood as a force that reshaped whole lives. That is why the archive must be read not simply for fact but for structure. What does it permit women to be? What does it deny them? Whose words dominate? What kinds of feelings survive only by accident? These questions are especially urgent in the female asylum record because women's voices were already so vulnerable to being filtered through others. A woman might write a letter, make a plea, deny a charge, or explain herself, but even then her words were usually enclosed by commentary. Doctors assessed them. Clerks copied them. Officials summarized them. The woman's speech survived, if at all, in a frame designed to manage it. The archive preserves voice and subordinates it at the same time. There is something deeply characteristic of 19th-century power in this arrangement. Women were heard most clearly when they had become impossible to ignore, and even then they were seldom allowed to stand alone. Broadmoor inherited this pattern from the courts and from the wider social order. It did not create female historical silence, but it formalized it. To read the women of Broadmoor now is therefore to read across layers of mediation: family testimony, press narrative, legal judgment, medical theory, institutional observation, and later historical selection. No woman comes to us untouched by these processes. This does not mean recovery is impossible. It means recovery must be modest and exacting. The aim is not to pretend that the archive can yield the women back in full. It cannot. Nor is the aim merely to expose institutional bias and stop there. Such exposure is necessary but incomplete. The task is to hold together what the records do preserve: acts, pressures, language, routines, fragments of speech, traces of emotions, structures of judgment, and allow the women to emerge not as complete portraits, but as historical presences that exceed the categories imposed on them. Incompleteness need not produce emptiness. It can produce care. This care matters most where women have been reduced either to monsters or to examples. Broadmoor's archive encourages both reductions. A woman can appear terrifying because the record begins at violence. She can appear exemplary because later writers use her to illustrate themes in legal, psychiatric, or feminist history. Both moves risk flattening her again. The purpose of returning to these women is not to redeem them from all judgment, nor to impose a sentimental innocence, but to resist reduction itself. They were not merely monsters, and they were not merely case studies. They were women whose lives became entangled with one of the 19th century's most revealing institutions. In that sense, Broadmoor's female archive tells a larger story about who history chooses to remember. It remembers women when they become problems. It remembers them when they disturb order, violate expectation, or force the state to speak. It is far less reliable at remembering them as ordinary feeling subjects whose suffering accumulated gradually inside systems not designed for their survival. That imbalance should trouble us. It should also sharpen our method. The absence of ordinary detail is not proof that these women lacked ordinary lives. It is proof that ordinary female lives were rarely preserved unless they ended in scandal or confinement. The pre-Edwardian women in this book therefore stand at the edge of two disappearances. First, the disappearance into the institution itself, where custody replaced social life. Second, the disappearance into history, where only some names endured and most became faint. To write them now is to interrupt that second disappearance, however imperfectly. It is to insist that these women belong not just to the history of crime or psychiatry, but to the history of women, labor, motherhood, family, class, and the state. Broadmoor did not erase them completely. Left too much paper for that. But it left paper on its own terms. Those terms have shaped everything that followed. Who became famous, who remained obscure, who was read as tragic, who was wicked, who was ill, who was cautionary, and who was not read at all. The archive is therefore not just a source. It is part of the story. It tells us how institutions convert living women into historical forms, and how later generations inherit those forms as if they were transparent truth. They are not. But neither are they useless. They are the remains of unequal encounters between women and authority, and they can still be read against their own grain. That, ultimately, is what the women of Broadmoor require. Not rescue into certainty, but attention strong enough to hold contradiction. Mary Ann Parr, Christiana Edmonds, Blanche Bastable, Rebecca Loveridge, Rebecca Turton, Julia Spickernell, Elizabeth White, and the others who moved through these pages cannot be restored intact. Their records are too partial, too mediated, too burdened by judgment. But they can be seen more clearly than the 19th century allowed. They can be returned to context. Their confinement can be read not as isolated curiosity, but as part of a broader history in which gender, class, medicine, and law worked together to define which women were tolerable and which were to be enclosed. In the end, memory is not innocent. It chooses, narrows, repeats, and omits. Broadmoor did all of these things. So did the public. So do historians. The question is whether those choices can now be made differently. This book has followed pre-Edwardian women through accusation, violence, illness, motherhood, notoriety, institutional routine, and historical fading. What remains after all that is not a single moral lesson. It is something more difficult and more valuable. The recognition that the women of Broadmoor were never only what the asylum, the courts, or the newspapers said they were. They were women whose lives became trapped in systems larger than themselves, and whose traces, though broken, still asked to be read with seriousness rather than sensation. Beyond the gates, some were forgotten. Within the archive they remain, not whole, not silent, and not yet done speaking. Conclusion. Women, madness, and the walls that held them. Broadmoor was built to solve a problem the 19th century believed it could no longer leave scattered across prisons, workhouses, county asylums, and private households. Men and women who had committed serious offenses while judged insane, or who had become entangled in the law through obvious mental disturbance, were to be gathered into one place, observed under medical authority and held apart from the public. It was a modern answer, administrative in design and moral in ambition. It promised order where there had been uncertainty, treatment where there had been improvised custody, and safety where there had been fear. For the women who entered its gates, however, Broadmoor was never simply an answer. It was the final stage in a longer history of pressure, judgment, and interpretation. By the time the institution received them, much had already happened. A child had died. A mother had broken. A daughter had turned violent. A household had become unmanageable. A respectable woman had become a scandal. A mind had become unreadable to those nearest it. The asylum inherited these lives at the moment when society could no longer tolerate their instability, but it did not create the conditions from which that instability emerged. That is the central lesson of the women in this book. They were not all alike. Some were poor, some respectable. Some were mothers, some daughters, some women whose domestic roles had already begun to fray. Some were publicly notorious. Others barely survived the archive at all. Their offenses and alleged offenses varied, as did their histories, their emotional worlds, and the social meanings attached to them. Yet beneath those differences lay common structures. Again and again, these women were judged through ideals of femininity that left little room for anger, despair, violence, contradiction, or collapse. Again and again, their suffering was filtered through assumptions about the female body, the female mind, and the female place within home and family. Again and again, Broadmoor became the place where those judgments were stabilized. The asylum then was not separate from Victorian society. It was one of its clearest expressions. Its walls may suggest removal, but in truth Broadmoor concentrated values already present outside. The institution depended upon distinctions the wider culture had long rehearsed: sane and insane, maternal and unnatural, respectable and fallen, governable and dangerous. Medicine gave these distinctions professional language. Law gave them force. Families and newspapers supplied the social atmosphere in which they made sense. Broadmoor brought them together in daily practice. To study the women confined there is therefore to study not an isolated institution, but a wider network of power operating through gender, class, and authority. One of the most striking features of that network was the treatment of motherhood. The 19th century idealized the mother as the moral center of domestic life, yet many of the women sent to Broadmoor arrived through acts involving children. Infanticide, attempted child killing, and maternal despair recur with grim force across the female history of the asylum. These cases were met with horror, but also with a qualified sympathy that often took medical form. A mother who killed might be understood as mad where another offender would be judged merely wicked. At first glance, this appears merciful. In some cases it was. But the mercy was partial and complicated. It preserved the ideal of motherhood by locating deviation inside the mother's disordered mind rather than in the world that had shaped her exhaustion, shame, grief, or social abandonment. The same pattern appears elsewhere in different form. Respectable women who committed shocking acts were often treated as aberrations from femininity, their violence made legible through nerves, obsession, or hidden pathology. Daughters who attacked mothers, wives, or female relations who destabilized households, women whose conduct became erratic or frightening to relatives. All were interpreted through a cultural framework that insisted women should absorb tension, not generate it. Once they failed at that task, madness provided an explanation that was at once punitive and protective. It spared some from harsher legal penalties while also delivering them into indefinite institutional control. This double movement, mercy and control together, runs through Broadmoor's entire female history. It is what makes the asylum so difficult to read morally. Broadmoor was not simply a dungeon in medical disguise. Nor was it simply a humane refuge for sick women who had nowhere else to go. It was both more and less than either description allows. It could provide shelter, food, routine, and some relief from immediate crisis. It could also strip women of autonomy, redefine them through diagnosis, and hold them for years under the sign of treatment. To recognize its complexity is not to soften its coercion. It is to see more clearly the form that coercion took in a society increasingly confident that medicine and administration could manage human disorder better than punishment alone. For women, that confidence rested heavily on interpretation. The women of Broadmoor were watched, described, and classified in ways that reflected deep assumptions about feminine behavior. A man might be dangerous and remain recognizable as a man. A woman who became dangerous often ceased, in the eyes of others, to be properly feminine at all. Her violence therefore demanded special explanation. Was she unsexed by madness? Broken by childbirth? Undone by grief? Corrupted beneath a respectable surface? The very need for such questions reveals how narrow the Victorian model of womanhood remained. Women were expected to be transparent in virtue, legible in feeling, and relational in identity. Those who were opaque, resistant, furious, or self-divided threatened more than immediate safety. They threatened a social order built on confidence that women could be known. Broadmoor existed partly to restore that confidence. Inside the institution, uncertainty became case material. A woman's moods, habits, words, and silences were all gathered into the expanding narrative of who she supposedly was. Yet the archive left by this process never fully settles the matter. Again and again the women resist final capture. Their records are rich and partial at once. They preserve acts and diagnoses, but also fragments of grief, confusion, endurance, complaint, and unexplained remainder. What the institution most wanted was coherence. What history finds instead is broken complexity. That brokenness is not merely an archival inconvenience. It is one of the book's most important truths. The women of Broadmoor do not yield a single moral lesson. They do not arrange themselves neatly into innocence on one side and monstrosity on the other. Some caused terrible harm. Some were themselves deeply harmed. Many were both. Their stories force a confrontation with the inadequacy of simple judgment. They ask what happens when law, medicine, and domestic ideology all attempt to explain women whose lives have ruptured beyond ordinary comprehension. They show that explanation is never neutral. It distributes sympathy unevenly. It decides whose suffering counts, whose violence can be medicalized, whose class earns pity and whose does not. Class indeed remained everywhere. Poor women came to Broadmoor from lives of overwork, insecurity, and social exposure. Respectable women arrived under different forms of pressure, but with very different vocabularies available to explain their decline. A middle-class woman might be tragic, overstrained, nervously unwell. A working-class woman might be coarse, exhausted, degraded, or simply broken by hardship. The institution could confine them both, but it did not describe them in the same moral register. Broadmoor's female history is therefore inseparable from the history of social hierarchy. It reveals not only what Victorian Britain feared in women, but which women it feared in which ways. If there is a single thread running through all these lives, it is perhaps this: the women sent to Broadmoor were those who had become unbearable evidence of the limits of the world around them. They exposed the false confidence of domestic ideals that praised motherhood while leaving mothers unsupported. They exposed the fragility of respectability as a guarantee of moral safety. They exposed the instability hidden within households assumed to be naturally ordered. They exposed the inadequacy of legal categories that wanted clear distinctions between criminality and madness where lived experience offered neither. They exposed, too, the hunger of Victorian culture for female transgression as spectacle, followed by an equally intense desire to enclose and forget it. Broadmoor answered that desire by holding women after the moment of scandal had passed. It converted dramatic public narratives into long private routines of observation, labor, and waiting. There is something profoundly revealing in this shift from spectacle to duration. The public wanted the terrible act and the reassuring verdict. Broadmoor dealt with what came after: years of confinement, uncertainty, aging, adaptation, grief, and sometimes disappearance. In this sense, the asylum was the place where society sent not only its disturbed women, but its own unresolved contradictions. Those contradictions remain visible in the archive. Some women survive there vividly. Others only barely. Some names still carry the echo of headlines. Others lie in files almost untouched. Yet even the thinnest record insists on one thing: these women were more than the categories under which they were confined. They were not merely criminal lunatics, not merely examples of infanticide, hysteria, moral insanity, or domestic tragedy. They were women whose lives unfolded in relation to poverty, labor, family, illness, desire, shame, social surveillance, and institutional power. To read them only as cases is to repeat the narrowing gesture that defined them in life. This book has tried instead to read them as historical subjects. That does not mean redeeming every act or smoothing away the damage done to others. It means refusing reduction. It means recognizing that women who entered Broadmoor did so from worlds already structured by inequality and expectation. It means seeing that madness was not merely a private defect but a category shaped by social need. It means acknowledging that institutions can be simultaneously necessary, violent, protective, and distorting. Above all, it means allowing these women to remain difficult, morally difficult, emotionally difficult, historically difficult, rather than forcing them back into the neat narratives that once made their confinement easier to accept. The pre-Edwardian women of Broadmoor deserve that difficulty. They lived before the political and cultural shifts that would alter how women's rights, citizenship, and mental illness were publicly discussed in the 20th century. Their world was one in which domestic ideals remained intensely powerful, psychiatric authority was still consolidating, and the law struggled to manage cases that lay between guilt and derangement. To study them is therefore to look closely at a formative moment in modern history, a moment when the state was learning how to classify and contain troubled women in ways that still feel disturbingly familiar. For the walls of Broadmoor, however specific to their place and time, belonged to a broader pattern. They were physical expressions of an enduring human impulse, to separate out those whose suffering frightens us, whose actions disturb us, and whose existence challenges the categories by which society reassures itself. Women have often been especially vulnerable to this impulse when they fail to embody the roles assigned to them. That is why the history of Broadmoor matters beyond the institution itself. It is a history of what happens when gendered expectation meets law, medicine, and force. And yet the women remain. They remain in the admission books, the trial reports, the case notes, and the fragments of speech preserved by clerks and doctors. They remain in the uneasy spaces between diagnosis and experience. They remain in the questions their lives still ask. What burdens were women expected to carry before collapse became visible? Why were some forms of female suffering recognized only after they turned violent? How did motherhood become both ideal and trap? When did a finding of insanity act as mercy, and when as another form of sentence? What kinds of women were granted complexity and what kinds were reduced to warning? There are no final answers to these questions. History rarely offers them. But there is value in returning to the women who forced them upon us. Mary and Parr, Christiana Edmonds, Blanche Bastable, Rebecca Loveridge, Rebecca Turton, Julia Spickernell, Elizabeth White, and the others who moved through these pages were once enclosed by the institutions and narratives of their age. They can never be fully released from those enclosures. The archive itself is one of them. But they need not remain there unquestioned. Their stories, however partial, allow a different kind of reckoning. They reveal an institution and a society in the act of explaining women away. And they reveal, too, how incomplete that explanation always was. Broadmoor held these women. History does not have to hold them in quite the same way.